Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moment I stepped into the house, something felt wrong. Not obvious, just a slight dissonance at the edge of perception, like a perfectly tuned piano with one string stretched a quarter tone flat. Most people wouldn't notice, but after 15 years of audio engineering, my ears had become hypersensitive instruments. Sound was my life, my obsession, my profession. And there was something deeply unsettling about the acoustics of this place. I had rented the old Victorian specifically for its isolation. Perched on the edge of a mountainside in western Montana, the nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a winding dirt road. Perfect conditions to record my breakthrough album. The project that would finally establish me as more than just another technician twisting knobs for more talented artists. At 30, I was running out of time to make my mark. This album would be my legacy. The real estate agent had mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving abruptly, a composer who'd lived here for just 4 months before breaking his lease. I didn't press for details. The price was right, and the house's natural reverb was exceptional, with high ceilings and hardwood everything. The spacious living room would serve as my main recording space, while a small room upstairs would become my mixing studio. Setting up my equipment took 3 days. I arranged my microphones meticulously, positioning them to capture the room's natural acoustics. My vintage analog console was the centerpiece, a restored 1970s Neve board that musicians paid top dollar to record through. I'd invested nearly every penny I had into my equipment. This project would either launch my career or leave me bankrupt. The first recording session went perfectly. I laid down some guitar parts, simple melodies that would form the foundation of the album. The playback sounded even better than I'd hoped. Warm, full-bodied, with a textural depth that digital recording could never capture. I worked until after midnight, finally collapsing into bed with the satisfied exhaustion that comes from good work. I woke at 3:17 a.m. The red digits of the alarm clock were the only light in the unfamiliar darkness. Something had pulled me from sleep, a sound. I held my breath and listened. Nothing but the house settling, the wind in the eaves. Then I heard it again, the faint but distinct sound of a piano note. A single A-flat, held for perhaps 3 seconds before fading. There was no piano in the house. I convinced myself it was a dream, some auditory hallucination on the edge of sleep. But when I checked my equipment the next morning, the recording light on my main console was illuminated. It had been running all night. Against my better judgment, I played back the overnight recording. For the first 6 hours, there was nothing but the ambient noise of an empty house, the refrigerator hum, the occasional creak of wood contracting as the temperature dropped. Then, at precisely 3:17 a.m., a clear, unmistakable A-flat rang out, followed by silence. 3 minutes later, a G, then an E-flat. The notes were crisp, deliberate, spaced exactly 3 minutes apart. The final note came at 3:29 a.m., a low C that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps I'd picked up interference from an AM radio station, or maybe there was some bizarre acoustic phenomenon caused by the mountain winds passing through the house's old ductwork. I spent that day soundproofing my studio space, sealing windows with foam insulation and hanging heavy blankets over door frames. The second night, I made sure to switch off all recording equipment before going to bed. I even unplugged the main power conditioner, ensuring that nothing could activate without my knowledge. I slept soundly until dawn, but when I entered the studio that morning, the equipment was running, somehow reconnected to power. The recording light glowed red, and the analog reels of my tape machine rotated slowly. My throat tightened as I approached the console. The master fader was pushed all the way up, and the VU meters danced with input I couldn't hear. The playback revealed more notes, different this time, forming what sounded like the beginning of a melody. The sequence repeated 4 times throughout the night, each iteration more complex. with subtle variations in timing and intensity. It was as if whatever was creating this music was practicing, refining, learning. I spent that afternoon in town, seeking any information about the house's history. At the local historical society, an elderly volunteer regarded me with undisguised concern when I mentioned my address. She explained that the house had been built in 1897 by a composer named Elias Blackwood, who'd claimed to have discovered what he called the music of the spheres, harmonic patterns that supposedly existed in the space between worlds. According to local legend, Blackwood conducted experiments in the house, attempting to create music that would serve as a bridge between dimensions. He disappeared in the winter of 1901, leaving behind pages of bizarre musical notation and journal entries describing entities of pure sound that communicated through his instruments. The volunteer hesitated before adding that, over the decades, several musicians who'd lived in the house had reported strange phenomena. One had suffered a complete psychotic break, claiming that something was using his compositions to create a doorway. I returned to the house with a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. Part of me wanted to pack my equipment and leave immediately, but another part, the part that had always pushed me to chase the perfect sound, was intrigued. If there was something unusual about the acoustic properties of this house, perhaps I could harness it, use it to create something truly unique. That night, I set up additional microphones in various rooms and left all the recording equipment running. I placed a small digital recorder under my pillow and another in my shirt pocket. If something was creating music in this house, I would capture it from every angle. Sleep came reluctantly, my body tense with anticipation. I drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake at every creak and groan of the old house. Around 3 a.m., I sensed a change in air pressure, as if a door had opened somewhere. The temperature in my bedroom dropped noticeably. I lay paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs as I strained to hear through the silence. The first note began so quietly that I wasn't sure I was hearing it, a sustained E that seemed to originate from somewhere inside my own head, rather than from the air around me. More notes followed, building into a complex pattern that made no musical sense according to conventional theory. The intervals between notes were all wrong, creating dissonance that should have been unpleasant but instead induced a state of hypnotic fascination. I felt compelled to get up, to find the source of the music. My limbs moved mechanically, as if controlled by something outside myself. I shuffled toward my studio, drawn by the sounds that were growing in complexity and volume. The melody, if it could be called that, now contained elements that shouldn't have been possible, tones that existed in the spaces between standard notes, harmonics that seemed to vibrate with colors rather than sounds. In the studio, my equipment was running at full capacity. The meters on my recording console were pinned in the red, and the reels of the tape machine spun so rapidly that I feared they might fly apart. But what struck me most was that I was hearing instruments that weren't present: strings, woodwinds, percussion, and other sounds I couldn't identify. The music was building toward something, a crescendo of impossible complexity. As it peaked, I saw them, or rather, I perceived them, because what entered the room didn't have a form that could be seen with eyes. They existed in the fluctuations of the sound waves themselves, entities composed of vibration and resonance. They moved through the air like ripples in a pond, distorting everything they passed through. When they moved through me, I felt my bones vibrate, and my skull buzz with frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process. I woke on the studio floor, sunlight streaming through the windows. All my equipment was off and the room was silent. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed the entire episode. Then I noticed the tape machine. The supply reel was completely empty, hours of tape unspooled and wound tightly on the take-up reel. With trembling fingers, I rewound the tape and pressed play. What I heard defied explanation. The recording contained a complete composition unlike anything I'd ever encountered. The structure was alien, the tonality outside conventional music theory, yet it displayed an internal logic that was undeniable. It felt almost mathematical in its precision, yet deeply emotional in a way I couldn't articulate. Most disturbing was that I recognized fragments of my own guitar recordings, manipulated and integrated into this larger work. Whatever was creating this music was using my compositions as raw material, incorporating them into something vaster and more intricate. I should have left then. Any rational person would have. But I was a sound engineer. My entire identity was built around capturing and shaping audio. The prospect of documenting something that defied the known laws of acoustics was too tempting. I decided to continue recording, but with a new approach. I would try to communicate with whatever was creating this music, to establish parameters, perhaps even to collaborate. I spent that day setting up additional equipment, more microphones, spectrum analyzers, even an old EVP recorder used by ghost hunters to capture electronic voice phenomena. That night, I left a verbal message on the tape before starting the recording. I asked what they wanted, why they had chosen this house, this moment, me. Then I played back some of the musical patterns they had created, followed by my own interpretations, responses composed using similar tonal structures but with human musical sensibilities. I stayed awake, seated at my mixing console with headphones on, listening to the empty channels. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just as exhaustion began to pull me towards sleep, I heard it. A faint whispering that grew in clarity until I could make out words beneath the static. We have always been here, in the spaces between notes, in the silence between heartbeats. You humans brush against us when you create, when you arrange sounds in patterns that approach our language. But you, with your instruments that capture and replay, you have provided us with tools we lacked. The voice, if it could be called that, explained that the music they were creating was indeed a doorway, but not in the way humans might understand. It wasn't about physical travel between dimensions, but about perceptual shifts, changes in the way reality could be experienced and manipulated through sound. Night after night, the composition grew more complete. I began to understand fragments of its structure, how certain combinations of frequencies created effects that could alter consciousness, how rhythmic patterns could synchronize with brain waves to induce specific mental states. I contributed my own elements, guided by suggestions that came through the recordings. My sleep became fragmented, my days a blur of technical adjustments and obsessive analysis of each night's progress. I lost weight. Friends who called went straight to voicemail. The album I had come here to create was forgotten, replaced by this all-consuming collaboration with entities I couldn't see or touch, but whose presence I could feel with increasing intensity. As the composition neared completion, strange phenomena became more pronounced. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Temperatures in rooms fluctuated wildly. The electrical system of the house became erratic, lights dimming and brightening in patterns that matched the rhythmic structure of the music. Most disturbingly, I began to experience moments where reality itself seemed to waver, like heat distortion above hot pavement. During these episodes, I glimpsed overlapping versions of the room I was in, the same space but with subtle differences, as if I was seeing multiple possibilities existing simultaneously. The entities explained through our recorded exchanges that the completed composition would create a sustained state where these perceptual boundaries remained fluid. They spoke of it as liberation, freedom from the tyranny of experiencing reality through a single fixed perspective. What they didn't explain, but what I gradually came to understand, was that this fluid state would make it easier for them to influence the physical world. Each time we worked on the composition, their ability to manipulate objects and energy increased. They were using me and my equipment to create conditions that would give them greater access to our reality. On what I knew would be the final night, as we prepared to record the concluding section of the composition, I made my decision. While the entities were focused on fine-tuning certain frequency relationships, I subtly altered key elements of the recording setup. I introduced deliberate imperfections into the signal chain, misaligned tape heads, slight phase cancellations, carefully placed microphone feedback loops. The entities noticed immediately when the recording began. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my equipment began to malfunction in ways that couldn't be explained by normal electrical problems. The tape machine's motors strained, producing a high-pitched whine that made my fillings ache. Static electricity crackled across every surface. "What have you done?" The question vibrated through me, not as sound but as pure sensation. I explained that I had created dissonance within their perfect system, introduced human error and limitation into their mathematically precise composition. I had corrupted their doorway with uncertainty, with the very imperfection that made human music human. Their reaction was immediate and violent. My console sparked and smoked. Tapes unwound themselves, ribbons of magnetic film writhing like snakes across the floor. The windows shattered outward, and a wind that couldn't have been natural howled through the house, carrying away papers and lighter equipment. I ran from the studio as the ceiling began to crack, plaster raining down on the now ruined recording setup. Outside, I watched from a safe distance as lights flashed inside the house, illuminating the windows with colors that shouldn't exist. The air around the structure seemed to bend and warp, as if space itself was being folded and unfolded by unseen hands. By dawn, it was over. The house stood silent, looking perfectly normal in the early morning light. I approached cautiously, half expecting to find it transformed or damaged beyond recognition. Instead, everything was as it had been when I first arrived, except for my studio, where every piece of equipment was rendered useless, circuits fried, moving parts fused together, tape and wiring melted into abstract sculptures. I salvaged what I could and left that afternoon. Before departing, I buried the master tapes deep in the woods behind the house. Even corrupted and incomplete, I couldn't risk anyone ever trying to reconstruct what we had created. I never returned to sound engineering. These days, I live in a small apartment in the city, surrounded by constant noise, traffic, neighbors, the hum of urban life. I find comfort in these ordinary sounds, in their randomness and imperfection. Sometimes, when I'm between sleep and waking, I think I can still hear fragments of that composition playing at the edges of perception. In those moments, I focus on the mechanical ticking of my bedside clock, anchoring myself in its rigid, predictable rhythm until the other sounds fade away. But on particularly quiet nights, when I catch myself listening too carefully to the silence, I turn on every noise-making device I own: television, fan, radio, anything to fill the room with sound. Because I know what exists in perfect silence, in the spaces between notes, in the pauses between heartbeats. And I know they're still listening, waiting for someone else with the right equipment and the wrong curiosity to help them finish what we started. Story 2. The first time I noticed something was wrong at Le Patrimoine wasn't when the knives rearranged themselves overnight. It was the taste of my own cooking, suddenly elevated beyond my capabilities, carrying notes I'd never consciously added. Something had changed in the century-old kitchen, and whatever it was seemed to be using my hands. I'd been the sous chef at Le Patrimoine for just under 3 months when the incidents began. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of what was once a grand estate dating back to the 1880s. Located in New Orleans' Garden District, it had survived hurricanes, fires, and multiple renovations. The building whispered with history, creaking floorboards, ancient pipes that clanged at odd hours, and the distinctive smell of old wood and settled time. Chef Marceau had hired me, despite my limited experience in fine dining. He'd tasted my food at a local bistro and claimed to recognize something in my approach to flavors that he couldn't articulate. My technique needed refinement, he admitted, but insisted technique could be taught while instinct could not. I was grateful for the opportunity, though I should have questioned why such a prestigious establishment had trouble keeping sous chefs. During my first 2 months, everything progressed normally. I learned the menu, adapted to the pressures of service at a Michelin-starred restaurant, and began to find my rhythm. Then came the night I stayed late to perfect a sauce for a new special. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier. I was reducing a stock when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The hair on my arms stood on end as goosebumps spread across my skin. The overhead lights flickered briefly, and from the corner of my eye I caught movement by the hanging pots. A copper saucepan swayed gently as if someone had just bumped into it, but I was alone in the kitchen, standing 6 feet away. I dismissed it as a draft from the ancient ventilation system and continued working. As I turned back to my stock, I noticed something peculiar about my reflection in the polished steel backsplash. For a fraction of a second, My hands appeared to be chopping something, though I was actually stirring the pot. When I focused on the reflection, everything matched my movements once again. Exhaustion, I decided. I'd been working 16-hour days for weeks. The next morning, I arrived early to prep and discovered all the knives had been rearranged in their magnetic strips. Chef Marceau was already there, muttering about the closing crew's carelessness. No one admitted to touching the knives, but we all assumed someone had cleaned the strips and replaced them incorrectly. That evening, I added the final touches to my sauce. Chef Marceau tasted it, and his eyes widened with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but tinged with something else. Concern? Fear? "This is unexpected," he said carefully. "What did you add?" I listed the ingredients, all standard for the recipe. He shook his head. "There's something else. Something I can't identify." The sauce became the talk of the evening. Customers requested extra portions, some asking if they could purchase containers to take home. One regular diner, a stoic judge who rarely offered compliments, asked to speak with me personally. The intensity in his eyes as he described the pleasure the sauce gave him made me uncomfortable. He spoke of it like an addict describing a fix. That night, I stayed late again to document the recipe exactly, convinced I must have accidentally added something extraordinary. As I worked in the empty kitchen, I noticed the temperature dropping again. This time, I watched as a ladle rose from its hook and hung suspended in midair for several seconds before settling back into place with a gentle clinking sound. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat beaded on my forehead despite the sudden chill. I turned slowly toward the large mirror that hung at the end of the line, used to monitor the pass without turning around. My reflection stood as I did, spatula in hand. But as I watched, frozen in place, my reflection's arm moved independently of mine, reaching for a container I couldn't see and adding phantom ingredients to an invisible pot. I dropped the spatula and backed away. My reflection matched my movements again, but its expression seemed to hold a knowing smirk mine didn't possess. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, drowning out the sound of my ragged breathing. I fled the kitchen, convinced I was having some sort of breakdown from exhaustion. The next day, I tried to request time off, but we were short-staffed and in the middle of our busiest season. Chef Marceau seemed distracted, obsessively tasting and retasting dishes before they went out. The restaurant was fully booked for weeks following a glowing review that specifically mentioned my sauce. I noticed chefs spending more time in the restaurant's basement archives, emerging with dusty ledgers and journals from previous owners. When I asked what he was researching, he mumbled something about understanding the building's culinary history. His eyes were bloodshot, his normally immaculate chef's coat stained with what looked like ancient dust. That night, I dreamed of the kitchen. In the dream, I was cooking, but my hands moved with unfamiliar precision, employing techniques I'd never learned. Shadowy figures surrounded me, watching hungrily as I prepared a feast of unfamiliar foods. The ingredients squirmed under my knife. I woke drenched in sweat, my sheets twisted around me like restraints. Over the following weeks, more inexplicable events occurred. Ingredients I hadn't ordered appeared in the walk-in. Equipment rearranged itself overnight. The cast iron pans, which had always been meticulously seasoned, developed a strange patina that nothing could remove. Most disturbing were the reflections. Every time I caught sight of myself in the polished surfaces of the kitchen, the steel countertops, the gleaming hoods, the copper-bottomed pans, my reflection seemed slightly out of sync. Sometimes it moved a split second before I did. Other times, it performed actions I wasn't doing at all. My cooking, meanwhile, improved dramatically. Dishes I'd struggled with for years suddenly came together perfectly. Flavors I combined on intuition created symphonies on the palate that had customers returning night after night. Many began to look unwell, pale and jittery, with a desperate gleam in their eyes as they ordered the same dishes again and again. They reminded me of the addicts I'd seen during my time working near the Ninth Ward, people who'd do anything for their next hit. I began researching the building's history. The official records claimed it had been a private residence before being converted to a restaurant in the 1920s. But in the city archives, I found older documents suggesting the land had originally belonged to a secretive group that had emigrated from Haiti in the 1700s. They had constructed a temple that was later demolished after allegations of unholy practices and cannibalistic rituals led to a raid by local authorities. The mansion had been built directly over the temple's foundations. My stomach churned as I connected the dots. The basement of Le Patrimoine still had exposed foundation stones that predated the current building. I'd seen them when retrieving wine from the cellar, but had never given them much thought. That night after closing, I descended to the basement with a flashlight. The wine cellar was well lit and modernized, but a narrow door at the back led to older storage areas that weren't in regular use. The air grew dense and stale as I pushed deeper into the building's guts. In the farthest room, I discovered a hidden trapdoor beneath decades of accumulated junk. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs as my trembling hands cleared away the debris. The ancient wooden door was carved with symbols I didn't recognize, worn smooth by time but still clearly visible. A voice in my head screamed at me to stop, to walk away and never return. Instead, I gripped the iron ring and pulled. The hinges protested with an ear-splitting shriek that made me wince. Stale air rushed upward, carrying the scent of old spices and something coppery and organic that reminded me of the walk-in when we hung dry-aging meats. My flashlight revealed a stone staircase descending into darkness. The steps led to a circular chamber with a raised platform in the center. What I had initially taken for a sacrificial altar was, upon closer inspection, an ancient cooking surface. Channels carved into the stone would have carried away fluids. Cooking oils, I told myself, ignoring the darker possibility. The walls were covered in faded murals depicting elaborate feasts and cooking preparations. As I shined my light across them, I realized with growing horror that the ingredients being prepared were unmistakably human. At the far end of the chamber stood a tarnished mirror in an ornate frame. Its surface was cloudy with age, yet somehow it still reflected the room with perfect clarity. I approached it cautiously, my reflection growing clearer with each step. But as I stood before it, I saw not my own face, but that of another man. He wore chef's whites of an ancient, unfamiliar design, stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. His eyes met mine, and his lips curled into a smile of recognition. Behind him, behind me, shadowy figures gathered around the cooking platform, their features indistinct except for their hungry, anticipatory expressions. My reflection began to move independently, demonstrating cooking techniques with practiced, elegant movements. Though there was no sound, I somehow understood he was teaching me, showing me the culinary secrets that had made my recent dishes so irresistible. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with gleeful malice. The temperature plummeted, and I felt invisible hands grasp at my chef's coat, trying to pull me toward the platform. My mouth went desert dry as pins and needles spread across my skin. I scrambled up the stairs on all fours, terror lending me speed I didn't know I possessed. I locked the trapdoor and fled the restaurant, driving home in a state of blind panic. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I expected to see the ancient chef staring back at me. In the safety of my apartment, I gulped down 2 fingers of whiskey and tried to make sense of what I'd discovered. The restaurant stood on the site of an ancient cult that had practiced ritual cannibalism disguised as haute cuisine. Somehow the spirits of those original chefs were using me, using us, to continue their practices. My improved cooking wasn't the result of my developing skills, but of an otherworldly influence guiding my hands. And worse, whatever ancient flavors or techniques they were introducing through me were creating a form of addiction in our customers. The desperate look in their eyes, their compulsive return despite growing ill, they were being prepared for something. Fattened up like livestock, I realized with a wave of nausea. I called in sick the next day and the next, ignoring Chef Marceau's increasingly frantic messages. On the 3rd day, he appeared at my door. His skin had a grayish pallor, and dark circles rimmed his bloodshot eyes. He'd lost weight, his chef's coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. He admitted he'd known about the building's history when he bought the place 5 years ago, but hadn't believed the stories of hauntings and curses. Then his first sous chef began producing dishes of extraordinary quality, drawing crowds and acclaim. When that chef left suddenly, claiming to see things in the mirrors, another took his place and experienced the same uncanny improvement. Each fled eventually, and each time, Chef Marceau had to find a replacement who had the right instinct, who was receptive to the influence of the temple's original chefs. He begged me to return, not to escape the influence, but to embrace it. The restaurant was more successful than ever. Reservations were booked months in advance. Food critics were calling it the most important culinary destination in America. I refused, explaining what I'd seen in the basement, the ancient altar designed for preparing human flesh, the addictive quality developing in our customers. Chef Marceau listened with an unsettling calmness, then admitted he'd already discovered all of this. He'd been consulting the journals of the previous owners, many of whom had embraced the dark influences and risen to culinary stardom before meeting unfortunate ends. He believed we could control it, channel the knowledge without surrendering to the darker aspects of the ritual. I wasn't convinced. The pallor of his skin, the tremor in his hands as he spoke, he was already losing himself to whatever entity resided in those mirrors. I packed my belongings that night and left New Orleans, driving until exhaustion forced me to stop. I found work at a small roadside diner in Arizona, as far from haute cuisine as possible. I told myself I was safe, that the influence couldn't reach me here. But sometimes, catching my reflection in the chrome of the diner's fixtures, I see a shadow of someone else looking back. And when I cook, simple, rustic food for truckers and locals, I feel my hands wanting to add ingredients that aren't on the shelf, to employ techniques I've never learned. The customers have started to compliment my cooking with increasing enthusiasm. Some have become regulars, appearing every day with the same desperate gleam I recognized in New Orleans. Last week, the owner mentioned expanding the menu, perhaps moving toward more sophisticated fare. I've been teaching him some of the techniques I learned at Le Patrimoine. We've ordered new equipment, including larger, more efficient knives, and a set of copper-bottomed pans that shine like mirrors in the right light. Sometimes at night, I dream of that underground chamber and the ancient chef who waits for me there. In the dreams, he's pleased with my progress, with how I've spread his influence to new feeding grounds. I wake with my hands moving through the motions of preparation, my mouth watering at the thought of the feast to come. I tell myself I'll leave tomorrow, find somewhere even more remote, somewhere I won't cook again. But the pantry is fully stocked, the reservations are coming in, and my reflection watches me from every polished surface, smiling with anticipation as it chops ingredients I can't see. Story 3. The silence in these mountains isn't peaceful. It watches. It waits. I noticed it the moment I stepped off the bus in this small Andean village 3 weeks ago. How the usual mountain sounds seemed to drop away whenever I mentioned the Eastern Trail. Now I understand why. Some paths aren't meant to be walked, some stories aren't meant to be told, and some souls aren't meant to remain their own. I came to the Andes seeking authenticity for my photography portfolio. Remote villages untouched by tourism, ancient traditions preserved in the isolation of these towering peaks. My guidebook mentioned this village as a hidden gem, perfect for photographers seeking to capture the real Andes. What it failed to mention was the trail. My first night at the hostel, I spread my maps across the wooden table, planning my routes while nursing a cup of coca tea to help with the altitude. When the elderly owner saw me tracing the eastern path with my finger, her weathered face tightened. She muttered something in Quechua before switching to broken English, suggesting other trails with forced enthusiasm. I nodded politely, but my curiosity was already piqued. What could be so special about that particular route? The next morning dawned crisp and clear, perfect light for photography. I packed my gear and headed east, ignoring the wary glances from villagers who saw which direction I was taking. The trail began innocuously enough. A narrow dirt path winding through scrubby highland vegetation, climbing gradually toward a distant ridge. I photographed everything. The unique alpine flowers, the dramatic clouds building over the peaks, the ancient stone walls occasionally bordering the path. It wasn't until I returned to my room that evening and downloaded the day's photos that I noticed it. A smudge in the background of one image, vaguely human-shaped but indistinct, like smoke caught in human form. I assumed it was a processing error or perhaps a villager in the distance I hadn't noticed. I deleted the image and thought nothing more of it. The next day I returned to the same trail, drawn by the pristine solitude. Again I photographed the striking landscape, venturing a bit farther along the path. My skin prickled occasionally with the sensation of being watched, but I dismissed it as the natural unease of being alone in an unfamiliar wilderness. Once I spun around suddenly, convinced someone was standing just behind me, but there was only empty trail and the whispering wind through the sparse vegetation. That night, reviewing my photos, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The figure appeared again, in 3 different images now. No longer just a smudge, but clearly humanoid, wearing what appeared to be ancient Andean ceremonial attire, and unmistakably closer than in yesterday's photo. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, a digital artifact, a trick of the light, perhaps even a local playing a joke. But deep in my gut, a primal warning stirred. That was the first night the dreams came. I found myself walking the same trail under a blood-red moon. Ahead stood the figure from my photographs, a man with skin like ancient leather, face painted with intricate geometric patterns in red and black. He wore a headdress of condor feathers and a tunic decorated with symbols I couldn't decipher. He didn't speak, merely raised a gnarled hand toward me, palm displaying a spiral pattern that seemed to swirl hypnotically the longer I stared. I woke with my heart hammering and my sheets soaked with sweat, the spiral pattern still burning in my vision. I told myself not to return to the trail. I even planned alternative routes over breakfast. Yet by mid-morning, I found myself once again on the eastern path, my feet carrying me there, as if by their own volition. This time I ventured further than before, reaching a plateau overlooking a secluded valley. Ancient stone structures, perhaps ceremonial in nature, dotted the landscape below. I photographed them meticulously, zooming in on the weathered carvings similar to the symbols I'd seen in my dream. The air grew suddenly cold around me, my breath fogging despite the midday sun. I felt it before I saw it, a presence standing directly behind me. Every hair on my body stood erect, my muscles locked rigid with primordial fear. Slowly I raised my camera and, with shaking hands, took a photo over my shoulder. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. Only when I returned to the village did I dare look at that image. The figure stood less than 10 feet behind me, no longer blurry, but in sharp focus. His eyes were black pits in his weathered face, the spiral pattern now visible on his palm as he reached toward the camera, toward me. That night he spoke in my dreams. His voice rustled like dry leaves, ancient and parched. He called himself Wera, a name that meant wind in Quechua, he said. Once a powerful shaman of his people, he had begun a ritual centuries ago to bind his spirit to the sacred mountain, ensuring his wisdom would protect his people for generations. But colonial invaders had attacked during his ceremony, killing him before it could be completed. Now his spirit was trapped between worlds, unable to move on, unable to fully manifest. He needed me, he explained. My body, my eyes, my hands, to complete what was left undone. The spiral marking on his palm was the symbol of the unfinished ritual, and now, he showed me my own palm in the dream. It was beginning to appear on my skin as well. I woke in terror, immediately checking my palm under the harsh light of my phone. Nothing was there, but a dull itching sensation lingered. I convinced myself it had just been a vivid nightmare fueled by the high-altitude coca tea and my overactive imagination. I resolved to leave the village the next day, but when morning came I noticed a small, pale spiral marking on my inner wrist. Subtle, like a scar beginning to form. My heart rate doubled instantly. I packed my bags with frantic energy, paid my bill, and practically ran to the small plaza where buses departed for larger towns. I never made it there. Somehow, despite heading directly south from the hostel, I found myself on the Eastern Trail again. I turned around, oriented myself carefully, and set off again toward the village. 20 minutes later, I was further along the Eastern Trail than I'd ever been before. Panic clawed at my throat. I dropped my bags and ran, downhill, uphill, cutting across country, using my GPS to navigate. No matter which direction I fled, within minutes I'd find myself back on that same accursed path, always a little further along than before. By nightfall, exhausted and terrified, I reached the stone structures I'd photographed the day before. Too tired to continue, I made reluctant camp in one of the more intact buildings. The spiral on my wrist had grown darker, larger, and was now accompanied by the beginnings of geometric patterns creeping up my forearm, patterns identical to those on Wera's skin. In my dreams that night, Wera didn't just speak to me, he showed me. His memories flooded my mind. His training as a young shaman, the sacred knowledge passed down through generations, the ritual that would have bound his protective spirit to the mountain for eternity. I felt his anguish at being cut down before his work was complete. His centuries of half-existence, waiting for someone suitable to finish what he had started. I woke to find my entire arm covered in the patterns, no longer looking like scars but like actual pigment beneath my skin. My fingernails had darkened, and when I caught my reflection in my phone screen, I saw the faintest outlines of facial markings beginning to form. More disturbing still were the changes I could feel inside. Foreign memories mingled with my own, knowledge of plants I'd never studied, Quechua words I'd never learned, ritual movements my muscles seemed to remember though I'd never performed them. Sometimes I'd catch myself standing in postures unfamiliar to me, or humming melodies I'd never heard before. I tried to document everything with my camera, perhaps hoping that creating a record would somehow anchor my fading identity. With mounting horror, I realized that in my newest self-portraits, my face was beginning to resemble Wera's. Not in actual features, but in expression, in the way I held my head, in the look behind my eyes. That night, my most desperate attempt to escape failed when I found myself scaling a cliff in the dark, only to emerge once again on the Eastern Trail. I collapsed, surrendering to exhaustion and the growing certainty that I would never leave this place. At least, not as myself. Wera came again in my dreams, but this time I confronted him. I demanded to know why he had chosen me, why he couldn't find peace and leave me be. His answer chilled me. I had chosen him. By taking the forbidden trail, by capturing his image, by feeding my curiosity despite all warnings, I had opened the door. The camera, he explained, was the perfect conduit, a soul catcher, similar to the ceremonial objects his people once used to contain spirits. When I woke, the transformation had accelerated. Both arms now bore complete ritual markings. The spiral pattern centered perfectly on my palm. My face and my camera screen showed geometric lines forming across my cheeks and forehead. Wera's memories now flowed continuously alongside my own, sometimes making it difficult to remember which experiences belonged to me. What terrifies me most is not the physical transformation, but how increasingly right it feels. The panic has given way to a strange acceptance. The knowledge flowing into me feels valuable, important. The ritual Wera needs to complete seems increasingly meaningful, even necessary. Today marks 3 weeks since I first arrived in this village, 7 days since I first set foot on the Eastern Trail. I've set up my camera to document what happens next. Tonight, under the same moon phase when Wera began his ritual centuries ago, I will return to the stone circle in the valley. I will use the knowledge that now fills my mind to complete the binding ceremony. Sometimes, in moments of clarity, I wonder if I'm still me at all, or if Thomas Jensen, photographer from Seattle, has already been completely consumed by Wera. Other times, I wonder if there was ever truly a separation between us, if souls across time aren't more connected than we realize. The sun is setting now. My hands, his hands, our hands, are gathering the necessary materials for tonight's ceremony. The spiral on my palm throbs with anticipation. The mountains around me seemed to be holding their breath. I've tried to leave one last record of what happened to me, though even now, writing these words, I'm not certain what me means anymore. Is it the frightened photographer who first stepped onto the forbidden trail? Or the ancient shaman who will finally complete his sacred duty tonight? Perhaps by dawn, the distinction won't matter. If you're reading this and see my photos, know this. Some trails are avoided for a reason. Some mountains keep what walks upon them. And some stories, like mine and Wera's, were always destined to become one. Story 4. And I remember the first time I felt truly unsettled, as if something in my ordinary life had cracked open to reveal a sliver of horror I'd never suspected. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I was staring at the dull blue light of my living room lamp reflecting against the window. For a moment I thought I saw a silhouette moving across the glass, but the darkness swallowed whatever shape might have been there. My heart thumped once, hard, and then settled into a rapid, relentless rhythm. I tried to calm myself by drawing a slow breath, but a sudden chill crept up my spine. That was the beginning, though I didn't realize it then, of a nightmare that would make me question my sanity and test the limits of my courage. My name is Martin, and at the time, I was 28 years old, working as a barista in a small, cozy coffee shop nestled between two antique stores on a quiet street. Before all this happened, I prided myself on being level-headed. My friends joked that I was too grounded to be spooked by anything, and I used to chuckle when I'd hear eerie stories from customers. But then the notes began arriving, each one a little stranger than the last, and soon enough, I was left wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. It started off innocently, or so I thought. One morning, I found a small piece of folded paper on the counter next to the espresso machine. There was no name on it, no clear indication of who had left it. Inside, it simply read, "I see your kindness." It felt strangely personal, but not necessarily threatening, more like a compliment I hadn't asked for. At that point, I assumed it was just a shy customer's way of expressing gratitude for a friendly smile or a well-crafted latte. There were regulars who often left little notes, typically to thank me for a good coffee or a pleasant conversation. The next note appeared about a week later. This time it wasn't on the shop counter, but on the small table where I usually stacked disposable cups. When I unfolded it, I could swear I smelled a faint trace of something metallic. The message read, "I've taken a piece of you to keep." A shiver rippled through me. I didn't understand what it meant. I glanced around the shop, but most customers were busy checking their phones or reading books, immersed in their own worlds. No one appeared to be watching me. My pulse sped up, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a tasteless prank. Soon, I began receiving odd little gifts in the staff break room as well. A broken pocket mirror with smeared red stains on one side, a key to a lock I didn't recognize, and most disturbingly, tiny plastic bags that contained hair or small clippings of nails. At first I thought it might have been some bizarre joke among co-workers, though none of them seemed the type to pull such twisted pranks. They all looked just as creeped out as I felt whenever I mentioned it. The metallic scent from the second note lingered in my memory. After a few days, I realized the red stains on the pocket mirror looked too much like dried blood. My hands trembled when I held it. My mouth felt dry, as if I couldn't form enough saliva to swallow. The break room lights, usually warm and comforting, suddenly seemed glaring and harsh, highlighting every imperfection in the small mirror's cracked surface. It was around this time I started checking over my shoulder while I worked, half expecting someone's gaze to pierce me from the corner of the room. In the following weeks, the gifts and notes grew more disturbing. A small music box was left by the garbage bin outside the shop. When I opened it, there was a tuft of dark hair tied with a piece of string. Another time, I found a small envelope with an ancient-looking coin coated in what seemed like rust, or something darker. Each discovery made my heart pound so fiercely I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. My coworkers reassured me that we had security cameras, but the camera feed never showed anyone clearly placing these items. It was just black static or frames lost to some technical glitch whenever I tried to replay the footage. One night, after closing, I stayed behind to clean the machines. I was the only one left, surrounded by the hum of the coffee grinders and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. That's when I heard something, a scratching sound against the back door. My breath caught in my chest. I stood frozen, the small of my back prickling with sweat. When I mustered enough courage to open the door, I found no one there, just a brisk wind that rustled the trash in the alley. But on the ground lay another envelope. This one had a smudged handprint that looked brownish red. My entire body shook as I picked it up, certain I should just throw it away. Instead, I opened it. The paper inside had 5 words scrawled in a shaky hand. "Soon you'll be with me." The next morning, I woke up in my apartment and decided that I needed more than the shop's cameras for peace of mind. I installed a small camera in my living room and another in my bedroom. Nothing sophisticated, just basic devices connected to my computer. Over the next few days, I began to review the footage every morning, hoping I'd find nothing unusual. I tried to rationalize that these gifts and notes might simply be left at the shop, not necessarily meant to carry over into my private life. But then I started noticing small discrepancies in my apartment. A photo frame on the bookshelf facing a different direction than usual, a chair slightly pulled out from under the table, my coffee mug placed on a counter I never used. It felt like subtle intrusions, as though someone was testing how much they could tamper with my space without me noticing. My palms would get clammy whenever I walked through the front door, worried about what I might find out of place next. Eventually, I reviewed the recordings and saw something I can never forget. At around 2 in the morning, there was a slight flicker in the video feed. Then, out of nowhere, a shape appeared in my living room. A woman dressed in dark clothing. She moved slowly, methodically, as if performing a silent ritual. My heart nearly stopped when I saw her hold up a small object, a lock of hair, possibly mine, and tie it to a bundle of something else. The worst part was that she seemed to turn directly toward the camera, but her face was covered by the shadows of her hood. There was a moment, just a second, when I swear her eyes glinted in the faint light, and then the feed went black. When it resumed, she was gone. I felt numb all day after I watched that recording. My legs trembled beneath me at the coffee shop, making it nearly impossible to stand behind the counter. I tried to confide in one of my coworkers, who asked a few worried questions. She suggested I call the police, but I only nodded absently. I started to question everything. If this woman could break into my apartment so easily, why hadn't she just attacked me outright? Instead, she seemed to want me to know she was there. That was more terrifying in a way. It felt like she was orchestrating a slow, deliberate campaign of torment. That same evening, I forced myself to watch more footage. I noticed her presence on multiple nights, always around 2 in the morning, always moving in the same slow, almost ritualistic manner. Each time, she'd collect something of mine, a pen I had left on the coffee table, a single sock from my laundry basket, strands of hair from my pillow. Once, the camera caught her standing over my bed, silently watching me sleep. I could see my own silhouette, chest rising and falling, completely unaware of the looming figure. My lungs constricted with pure horror when I realized she was close enough to feel my breath. I paused the video and sat there, hands shaking, skin clammy with sweat, heart pounding so loudly I thought my neighbors might hear it through the walls. The next few nights, I could hardly sleep. Every creak of the old pipes in my building made my eyes fly open. My sheets felt damp from my anxious sweat, and a sense of paranoia settled into my bones. I began to question my own behavior. Was I forgetting to lock the door, or was she picking the lock somehow? I double-checked the bolts and even purchased a new chain latch, but each morning, I'd still wake up to find evidence that she'd been there. A faint footprint on the windowsill, a small figurine on my counter that I certainly hadn't placed. Then came the most horrifying discovery. A small figurine that resembled a crude doll. It was propped against my bathroom mirror one morning when I woke up, its body made of cloth, its face sewn with dark thread. Tucked under the doll's arm was another note. This one was longer than the others. It said that she was forging a spiritual link, a connection that would gradually transfer my essence, my soul, if I believed her words, into the doll she kept on her altar. I felt my stomach twist, and I nearly retched at the thought. My mouth turned dry, and I had trouble swallowing. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it as some lunatic's delusion, but I had seen enough to know this person wasn't bluffing. Whatever was happening, it felt dangerously real. A few days later, a customer at the coffee shop mentioned noticing I looked pale and jumpy. My boss pulled me aside to comment that I seemed distracted and asked if everything was okay. He suggested that maybe I should take some time off. In indirect speech, he insisted I find a way to handle whatever was troubling me. I nodded mutely, feeling trapped in my own skin. That night, I stayed up reviewing more camera footage. In the most recent clip, she carried a small candle and a shallow bowl. She carefully placed something inside the bowl, something that looked suspiciously like a drop of blood. My blood? I realized I couldn't stay passive any longer. Even though part of me was terrified of confronting her, I felt an urgent need to do something. I decided to invest in better security, cameras that were harder to tamper with, more robust locks, and a motion detector. I installed them all in one day, skipping work to make sure everything was set up perfectly. The installer told me, in a reassuring tone, that these measures would definitely keep unwanted visitors out, or at least alert me immediately if someone tried to break in. I wanted to believe him so badly. For a brief period, I slept a bit better. My body was still exhausted, but the new layers of security gave me a fragment of hope. That hope was shattered the first night the motion detector went off. It was around 2:13 a.m. when I heard the high-pitched beep. My heart nearly exploded from my chest. I grabbed the baseball bat I now kept by my bed and checked the living room. The door was still locked, the chain in place, but the camera feed on my phone showed her standing in the center of my living room, motionless, as if she was perfectly aware the alarm had been triggered. She seemed taller, more imposing, and I noticed for the first time that there was a faint humming sound on the video, like chanting. I considered calling the police, but something in me froze. I was paralyzed by dread, uncertain of what might happen if I made her angry. Shaking uncontrollably, I moved from my bedroom and switched on every light I could. As I neared the living room, the chanting sound became more distinct, reverberating through the walls in a low murmur. But when I finally stepped in, the space was empty. The motion detector still blinked red, indicating a recent trigger. The door and windows were locked tight, yet she was gone, vanished like a specter. My hands shook so badly I dropped the baseball bat onto the floor. That morning, I found something new. A small bag containing a few drops of what looked like blood and a scrap of fabric cut from one of my shirts. A note read that the bond was almost complete, that my soul was nearly tethered to the doll. My vision blurred, and I had to grip the kitchen counter to steady myself. It was as if my reality was spiraling out of control. The rest of that day was a feverish blur. I spent hours pacing my apartment, feeling like the walls were closing in. My head pounded with an ache that refused to subside. I questioned whether I was cursed, marked by something beyond my understanding. The next few days were torture. Every time I shut my eyes, I imagined her silhouette hovering in the corner of my bedroom. Shadows that once seemed ordinary took on menacing shapes. I drank cup after cup of strong coffee, trying to ward off exhaustion, yet the lack of sleep was destroying my nerves. Sometimes I caught myself nodding off in the break room at work, jolting awake with my heart hammering, convinced she had whispered my name. People around me started giving me strange, concerned looks, but I no longer cared. My only focus was on surviving these nights. Finally, I decided I had to face her. Another note had arrived, stating that on the next full moon, the transfer would be complete. I had no idea what that truly meant, but it filled me with an indescribable terror. I refused to let my life be stolen by some deranged ritual. So on that night, I stayed up, lights off, camera ready, every sense on high alert. Around 2 a.m, I heard a soft scrape of metal against metal at my front door. My lungs seized, and my blood felt like ice in my veins. but I kept my grip tight on the baseball bat and forced myself to remain still. I couldn't see her at first. I only felt an oppressive presence in the darkness. Then, from the corner of my living room, a tall figure slowly emerged. Even with the hooded cloak, I sensed her eyes scanning the room, searching for me. My heartbeat thundered as I snapped on the light and yelled for her to stop. She remained eerily calm, lifting her head to reveal only the hint of a face in the shadows. There was no immediate rush, no direct confrontation. Instead, she raised a small, ragged doll, one that looked suspiciously like the one I had found in my bathroom, and held it out as if presenting her prized possession. I felt a wave of nausea. My breath turned ragged, and my skin broke out in a cold sweat. Despite my fear, I forced myself to step forward. My muscles trembled with each movement, but I managed to shout that this was going to end. I didn't care how unhinged I sounded. I demanded she leave. She tilted her head almost curiously, then, in a single swift motion, moved her hand in a strange pattern over the doll. The air seemed to thicken, and for a split second, I felt my vision blur, as though I was about to pass out. My legs weakened, nearly giving out beneath me, but I clung to what little courage I had. Before I could lose consciousness, I swung the baseball bat, not at her, but at the wall right behind where she stood, hoping to startle her. The crash was deafening. A picture frame shattered. The sudden noise seemed to break the ominous spell. She took a step back, and in a blink, she sprinted toward the door, disappearing into the hallway with uncanny speed. For several minutes, I stood there, bat in hand, chest heaving, sweat pouring down my forehead. My entire body was shaking so violently that I had trouble catching my breath. The doll was gone. She'd taken it with her. But so was she. When I finally dared to look out into the hallway, there was no trace of her. No footsteps, no shadows, just emptiness. In the aftermath, I called in sick to work for a week, locking myself in my apartment, triple-checking every camera feed. I never saw her on the footage again. Oddly enough, the notes stopped coming. It was as if she had abandoned her plan, or at least paused it. My apartment no longer felt entirely safe, but at least I was the only one inside. The cameras no longer displayed her unannounced visits. Months have passed now, and sometimes I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for another chance to complete her ritual. My nights are still restless. Every odd sound in the corridor, every flicker of light at the window, sets my nerves on edge. I often think about the possibility that the bond she spoke of might remain dormant, ready to consume me the moment I let my guard down. I still keep the cameras rolling, and every night I wedge a chair under the door handle before I go to sleep. Though I've survived the ordeal, walked away with my soul still mine, as far as I can tell, there's a heaviness in my chest I can't shake. Something about my world changed the moment I discovered those first clippings of hair and nails in the cafe. Now I go about my daily routines with a knot of unease gnawing at my insides. Even during the brightest hours of the day, when I'm chatting with customers or wiping the espresso machine clean, I feel the lingering chill of that encounter. It's as if my reality has been permanently warped by her presence, by the knowledge that real horror isn't always dramatic or bloody. Sometimes it's just the quiet certainty that someone is out there, watching, someone who believes they have a claim on your very soul. And as I write this, my pulse quickens once again, because I realize I've spent the last few minutes rechecking the corners of my bedroom. Even with the lights on, the corners seem darker than they should be. Every now and then, I catch myself wondering if she left a piece of herself behind, just enough to keep the link alive. I can't see it, but I sense it in every flicker of a shadow and every unfamiliar sound at night. The closest thing to peace I've found is the fragile comfort of having survived. But if her intention was to leave me forever changed, terrified of what lurks in the dark, she succeeded, and I can't help but feel that it's far from over. Story 5. The night I first arrived at the property, the sky was a bruise of deep purple and black, with the moon half hidden behind jagged clouds. An uneasy wind rustled the tall grasses, carrying a peculiar hush across the land, as though it were holding its breath. The main house, an aging relic of faded grandeur, loomed at the end of a winding driveway. Even from a distance, its windows stared like vacant eyes. The silhouette of a squat tool shed squatted near the tree line, barely visible in the gloom. Standing there in the driveway, suitcase in hand, I felt a rush of cold dread that clung to my lungs. Something about this place felt guarded, as if it resisted my very presence. My heart thudded unevenly in my chest, and I struggled to inhale a steady breath. I never expected to feel that kind of unnamed tension so soon, but it latched onto me like a leech. I had been hired to restore the main house, a century-old mansion known locally for its historical significance. People said the architecture was a testament to some lost style, an eclectic blend that defied neat categorization. Though I'm a professional architect with my share of strange projects, I found myself inexplicably nervous. The moment I stepped inside, the floorboards let out a prolonged groan, and a faint chemical smell, like old varnish or rotting wood, prickled my nostrils. A single bulb dangled from the high ceiling in the foyer, casting swinging shadows along the hallway. My palms felt clammy. I forced myself to focus on what lay ahead: measurements, sketches, and months of meticulous effort to restore this place to something habitable. Despite my best attempts to remain detached, there was a part of me that kept glancing at the windows, convinced I might see a figure peering in from outside. In the first week, the work proceeded without major issues. I began by surveying the structure, mapping out which parts needed the most immediate attention. A team of contractors was supposed to assist, but for some reason, their arrival was delayed. This left me alone on the property, relying on my own basic tools to start minor repairs. That was when I first noticed the strangeness of the tool shed. I remember finishing a day of patchwork on the west wall. My shoulders knotted with tension. I placed my hammer, nails, and measuring tape haphazardly in a corner of the shed. I was too tired to organize everything, so I decided I would straighten it the following morning. Yet, when I entered the shed the next day, everything was perfectly arranged. My tools lined up in size order, nails sorted into neatly labeled containers. My first thought was that perhaps the owner had visited and taken the liberty of tidying up. But the caretaker had told me the owner was out of the country. My heart hammered at the base of my throat as I stood in that small space, every hair on my arm standing on end. I felt scrutinized, like someone was watching from just behind my shoulder. Despite my unease, I carried on. Each day I left the shed in slight disarray, and each morning it was unnervingly organized. My attempts to dismiss it as a quirk of the property or some well-intentioned stranger failed to relieve the mounting anxiety. One evening I mustered enough courage to stay awake until after midnight, then quietly crept outside. I wanted to catch whoever was responsible. A flickering flashlight revealed the grass was still, the moonlight throwing shadows across the driveway. The shed door remained closed, yet when I opened it, I felt a sudden shift, as though I'd walked into a pool of frigid water. The air inside seemed almost solid, pressing against my skin. My breath caught in my throat. I found myself gasping, my heart pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my temples. Still, there was no one there, only my tools, arranged in a pattern that made no sense to me, perfectly aligned on shelves and countertops. In desperation, I began examining the shed for hidden entrances or trapdoors. I found none. However, as I inspected the corners, a bizarre distortion caught my eye. When I stood in the center of the floor and looked at the far wall, the angles seemed wrong. If I tilted my head just slightly, the shed appeared longer than it had moments before. It was like I was peering through a lens that warped the edges of the space. My pulse echoed in my ears, and my stomach churned with a nauseating sensation. Time itself felt elastic, as if the seconds stretched whenever I was inside. Later, when I staggered out, exhausted and jittery, I discovered that a couple of hours had passed, though it felt like only minutes. Not long after that, the real horror began. One morning I walked into the shed to retrieve a tape measure. To my shock, I saw myself, another me, dressed in clothes that I had never worn, sanding down a wooden board on the workbench. This other version of me didn't even look up at first. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat, replaced by a strangled squeak. Eventually, this doppelganger turned to face me with an eerily casual nod. Instead of forming clear words, it seemed to mouth something I couldn't decipher, then picked up a hammer and continued working. My lungs burned, and my skin broke out in cold sweat. Feeling terrified and disoriented, I stumbled backward out of the shed. My ears buzzed like they were filled with static. By the time I caught my breath enough to fling the door open again, the interior was empty. But the bench was covered with freshly sanded wood dust, evidence that I hadn't imagined the entire encounter. Over the next few days, it escalated. Each time I entered the shed, I risked finding different versions of myself. Some older, some younger, some with slight variations like a new scar on the forearm or a different haircut. My heart would pound so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. These other me's all seemed obsessed with some aspect of the restoration, leaving behind sketches of floor plans, half-built wooden frames, or cryptic notes describing structural changes for the mansion. My mind reeled with confusion. One version of me appeared more gaunt than I've ever been, pacing feverishly around the shed. Another had a large bruise on his temple and seemed to be scribbling nonsense in a notebook. My hands shook uncontrollably each time I touched the doorknob. I felt a primal fear that made my chest tight and my throat raw. Worst of all were the versions with completely black eyes. No white, no iris, just inky darkness. The first time I saw one, it stood near the back wall, meticulously hammering new beams together. At first, I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast across the face. Then it turned around, and my stomach lurched. There was something predatory in that gaze, or lack thereof. It felt like looking into a bottomless pit, a void that threatened to swallow my sanity. I froze, my muscles rigid. My breath came in ragged gasps and sweat trickled down my spine. That version of me, if it could even be called me, emitted an unsettling aura, as though it existed on the cusp of something not meant for human comprehension. When I tore myself away and rushed outside, my pulse hammered so violently that my vision blurred. I quickly realized these versions were competing, each implementing changes in the house that contradicted one another. At first, it was just small discrepancies. An added support beam in one corridor vanished the next day, replaced by a different design entirely. Then, the entire west wing layout kept shifting by a few inches at a time. Doorways moving, walls angled. My drawings no longer matched the reality I saw each morning. Panicked, I tried to document everything meticulously in a personal journal. I noted each inexplicable shift, each new blueprint that appeared on my drafting table without explanation. I felt my mind cracking under the weight of this impossible situation, the sense of time slipping through my fingers. My days became a disorienting blur, dominated by an incessant dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach. One evening, seeking temporary solace, I sat on the front porch of the house. The sky was bleak, a heavy mass of thick clouds. I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the throbbing headache that never left me anymore. I recall thinking about quitting, just walking away from the job. Yet every time I considered leaving, I felt an inexplicable compulsion to stay. I rationalized that the house needed me, that if I left, something far worse might happen. It was as if the property had tethered itself to my psyche. The night air felt charged, an electric tension that made my skin prickle. I listened to the distant rattling of tree branches and felt certain they were whispering warnings I couldn't quite decipher. The next day, I discovered new layers of nightmarish construction, twisting corridors, staircases that abruptly ended, and rooms that seemed to fold into themselves. The more I wandered, the more I felt the architecture was morphing into something that didn't belong in our dimension. Some floors were impossible angles that defied standard geometry. Some doorways opened into narrow passages that I couldn't see the end of, even with a flashlight. The walls felt alive, pulsing faintly when I pressed my hand to the old wood paneling. My breathing turned shallow, and I tasted copper in my mouth, as though fear itself had a metallic tang. I was losing any sense of normalcy. I confronted one of the black-eyed versions of myself in the shed. It regarded me with a calm, almost pitying look. Though it didn't speak aloud, I sensed it communicating a warning in my mind. like a sudden flash of images. I saw the house fully transformed into a grotesque structure of twisting halls and monstrous angles, a gateway for something indescribably alien. My pulse skyrocketed, and I swore I felt my heart skip. Despite the paralyzing terror, I refused to cede control. I had to stop the changes before the house became that nightmarish labyrinth. I rummaged through the shed, determined to remove or destroy any tools that might further the twisted alterations. My hands shook with adrenaline, but I managed to pile saws, hammers, nails, everything into a corner. When I finished, I turned to find the space empty again. Yet the corner where I'd stacked the tools was neatly reorganized, as if I'd never scattered them in the first place. Desperation drove me to plan one final attempt to reclaim the restoration. That night I mapped out every inch of the house, using old blueprints from the local archive, hoping to restore it to its intended form. I bolted the shed door from the outside, even stacking heavy cinder blocks against it. My chest tightened with anticipation, my stomach quivering with fear. At dawn, I worked furiously, reinstalling beams and replacing any warped materials with fresh wood. Sweat soaked through my shirt. My arms quivered from the constant hammering. Every few minutes I glanced anxiously at the shed, expecting to see that door swing open. I half anticipated a swarm of alternate selves, some normal, some black-eyed, emerging to stop me. But the door stayed shut. For a heartbeat, I dared to hope I could succeed. By mid-afternoon, the house looked more stable, more like a place that belonged to this world. My head throbbed with exhaustion, and my heartbeat still pounded in my ears. As I climbed down from a ladder, I heard a low hum reverberate from the direction of the shed, like a deep bass note that rattled through my bones. My mouth turned dry, and a chill slid down my back. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check the shed one last time. The door was open. The cinder blocks moved aside without any sign of force. Inside, the geometry churned as though the walls were breathing in and out. Tools I had never owned hung from the ceiling, glinting with an unsettling sheen. In the center stood the black-eyed version of me, silent and unnaturally still. My insides twisted in raw panic. It felt like I was being pulled into a gravitational well. Every muscle in my body screamed to turn and run, but I couldn't move. Then, in a burst of clarity, I realized I was still holding the flashlight. I flicked it on, directing its beam into the figure's face. It recoiled, as if in pain, and the shed's humming intensified. The very air trembled, sending dust and debris swirling. My heart felt like it was about to burst. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I darted forward and slammed the shed door shut. The wood shook violently, but I pushed with all my strength, adrenaline spiking through me. I locked the latch, then stumbled back, half expecting something to smash through the door. But nothing happened. The strange humming subsided. Without a second glance, I sprinted to my truck, started the engine with trembling hands, and peeled out of the driveway. My chest was constricted with terror, heart racing so fiercely that I was half sure I'd collapse. The mansion dwindled in the rearview mirror, its windows vacant as ever. As I drove away, I felt as though I was tearing myself from a magnet that had gripped my mind and twisted my sense of time. I didn't care where I would go. I just needed distance, needed to breathe air uncontaminated by that place. Even as I write this, safe in a rented apartment miles away, I can still feel the pull of that property. It's a dull ache behind my eyes, a sense that another version of me might be out there, wandering the shifting corridors, finishing the work I refuse to complete. I haven't gone back, and I don't plan to. But the nightmares persist. I still see the black-eyed versions in my dreams, building that terrible structure into something unholy. Yet even in the waking world, I can't fully escape the feeling that time is no longer linear for me. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection in a shop window and think I see a flicker of darkness where my eyes should be. My heart rate spikes, sweat breaks along my brow, and for a moment, I can't breathe. Then it's gone, and I'm left questioning whether my mind is truly fractured or whether the shed opened a door that can't be shut. I'm haunted by the possibility that I've carried that malignant distortion of time with me. I might be free from the property, but I'm not free of its presence. I suspect I never will be. Story 6. The night air in Lisbon felt heavy, as if weighed down by centuries of secrets that refused to drift away into the Atlantic. There was a dampness to it that clung to my skin, making every hair on my arms prickle. Shadows of the narrow cobblestone streets seemed to stretch unnaturally long, creeping and flickering under the sparse street lamps. I remember the way my heart pounded, an involuntary drumbeat echoing in my ears, even though I had no idea why. Something felt wrong from the start, an unsettling pressure that whispered I should never have taken that turn. I had come to Portugal seeking archival records for my research into esoteric maritime histories. My focus was on certain explorers who vanished without a trace, leaving behind cryptic journals and strange relics. The official libraries had yielded next to nothing, so I resorted to wandering through the older districts of the city, chasing rumors of hidden archives and private collections. Thus, I found myself in a dingy alley, stumbling upon a modest sign that read, in faint lettering, Antiquidades. A single dusty window revealed a cluttered interior, shelves crammed with objects that glinted under a single overhead light. I hesitated on the threshold, noticing how the wooden door gave off a low creak, almost like a groan. My palms were clammy as I pushed it open and was immediately greeted by the smell of aged leather, musty parchment, and a hint of something metallic, maybe rusted iron or old brass. The sensation of being watched hit me like a cold gust. My breathing got shallow and I noticed a faint tremor in my hands. The shop was eerily still, the light flickering weakly. There was a tall figure near the back. He wore a long coat, the material so dark it seemed to absorb what little light existed in that cramped space. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat when he spoke my name quietly, as though we were old acquaintances. The shock rattled my senses. We had never met, or so I believed. He offered no explanation, only gestured toward an array of objects displayed on a crooked wooden table. In a subdued voice, he indicated that these artifacts might interest me, given my research. He spoke with a measured politeness that felt like a thin veneer over something infinitely older and more profound. I remember feeling compelled to stay, despite the alarm bells sounding in my mind. I tried to ask how he knew me, but he offered only the vaguest of replies. In truth, it was hardly a reply at all, more of a soft statement that knowledge finds those who seek it. I felt a chill run down my spine, my chest tightening as though the walls were closing in. My tongue felt thick and dry, so I nodded, stepping closer to examine the items that inexplicably bore significance to my work. On that table lay several peculiar artifacts: a tarnished brass astrolabe, an ancient compass with strange etchings on the lid, a stack of brittle parchment sheets filled with incomprehensible scribbles, and an ivory figurine that depicted a robed figure with an expressionless face. My heart thudded harder when I recognized the style of cartography in the parchment. It matched that of one of the explorers I'd been researching, someone who had gone missing centuries ago. How could this antiquary possess such precise items connected to my topic, apparently waiting for me? Yet I bought them. That was the horrifying part, my overwhelming urge to hand over my money without protest. The transaction occurred in a hush, save for the rustle of paper currency and a single scraping sound as he wrapped each artifact in coarse brown paper. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and I couldn't decide if it was from excitement or anxiety. He told me very softly that I should handle these treasures with care. I felt my muscles tighten, my gut warning me that I'd just made a grave mistake. But I carried them out the door, feeling lightheaded, uncertain, and inexplicably drawn to their mystery. That night, back in my rented apartment, I tried to reassure myself. The room was small, just enough space for a bed, a rickety dresser, and a desk by a single window overlooking the street. My chest rose and fell erratically as I unwrapped the astrolabe first, the metal cold and covered in bizarre symbols. I ran my fingertips over its surface, noticing that my breath hitched each time I encountered an inscription that I couldn't decipher. Then I laid the other items out in front of me, the low glow from a single lamp turning their shadows into grotesque shapes. My hands shook more than I cared to admit. I dozed off sometime after midnight, only to be jolted awake by faint whispering. At first I assumed it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the window frame, but the murmurs had an unnatural cadence, like people speaking just out of earshot. My heart pounded so powerfully I could hear my pulse in my temples. I sat up, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs. The artifacts on the desk seemed to have shifted position slightly, though I couldn't be sure. My throat felt painfully dry, and when I tried to swallow, it felt as though I was gulping hot sand. The next day I returned to the libraries, hoping to confirm the origins of my newly acquired curios. Yet something was wrong. My memory felt fuzzy. I was forgetting trivial tasks, misplacing notes I'd carefully organized, and mixing up references I had once been certain about. That night, the whispering grew louder. This time, it was undeniably coming from the artifacts themselves. They spoke of centuries past, of voyages that never returned, of individuals who had vanished without leaving a single trace. I heard mention of names I recognized from my research, each one a missing person who had left behind nothing but rumors. My skin prickled at the realization that these objects belonged to those who had disappeared, as if they had been taken as souvenirs or trophies. The next morning, I felt more exhausted than ever, as though my sleep was stolen. I could barely recall details of my own research. Dates, places, references once locked in my mind were vanishing like sand slipping through an hourglass. Panic surged through me and I tried to steady my breathing, though it came out in frantic gulps. Stray images started to flash in my head. I saw the antiques in a different setting, maybe on a ship's deck or in a candlelit study from centuries ago. But just as the recollection took shape, it dissipated like a wisp of fog. During one of those restless nights, I thought I sensed movement in the corner of my room. The figurine seemed to vibrate under the lamplight, or perhaps it was a trick of my eyes. My skin crawled as I went over to examine it. I felt an intense jolt of something akin to static electricity. The ivory surface of that robed figure felt warmer than before, as though it had a pulse. I almost dropped it, my breath hitching, heart racing so violently that spots danced in my vision. Then I heard an unmistakable rasping voice, its origin unclear. It spoke of the collector, the one who gathers knowledge, who hoards secrets and memories. I sank onto the bed, body trembling, my clothes damp with perspiration. I recalled the antiquary's face, or tried to. My mind refused to capture his exact features. Each time I conjured an image, it felt half-formed, slipping away like a greased eel. I remembered the shape of him, the edges of a black coat, but the details were blurred. The more I tried to focus, the hazier it became. I felt my nerves fraying. My thoughts played a dreadful loop. He had known me, and he had known precisely what I was after, as though he had anticipated my arrival. Desperate for answers, I returned to the shop. But the door was locked and the window shuttered. When I pressed my ear against the battered wood, I heard a muffled scraping sound. A sudden burst of cold sweat trickled down my spine, and I realized I was trembling so badly that my breathing came in ragged gasps. I pounded on the door, my knuckles stinging, but received no response. Eventually I retreated to the street, scanning the empty alley with growing dread. Could I have dreamed the entire encounter? It felt real, too real for a mere nightmare. Night fell again. I remember the street lamp outside my window flickering erratically, as if signaling some impending doom. I tried to focus on the compass, scrutinizing the etchings etched around its lid. Shapes resembling eyes and swirling waves covered the metal, but the more I studied them, the more they seemed to shift, almost pulsating under my gaze. My stomach churned and I fought waves of nausea. The whispering began anew. An indistinct chorus of voices describing how the antiquary acquired them piece by piece. I heard mention of an unnamed ship's captain, a scholar from Cairo, a reclusive cartographer from Genoa, a merchant from the Far East. Each artifact corresponded to a person who vanished under baffling circumstances. None were confirmed dead or found again, merely lost to the world. I tried to piece together their cryptic stories, but it was like staring at a shattered mirror. My concentration wavered. my mind fogging as though a layer of cobwebs had been draped over my intellect. Then a new voice emerged among the sibilant murmurs, my own. It recounted my life, my early fascination with forgotten histories, the first time I stumbled upon an obscure reference in a dusty tome, my relentless hunt for the final clue that would unlock a hidden part of maritime legend. Yet, as I listened, I realized it described events I could barely remember. Each mention felt distant, like an echo. I began to panic, my heart pounding, mouth so dry I could hardly swallow. Was I forgetting my own past? At that point, paranoia seized me. I felt eyes on me at all hours, even though the apartment was empty aside from the old furniture. I constantly glanced over my shoulder. My reflection in the mirror looked gaunt, with dark rings under eyes I barely recognized. My pulse hammered every time a floorboard creaked, and I walked around with a knot in my stomach, convinced something was lurking behind me. Sleep became impossible. I'd jerk awake at the faintest sound, soaked in sweat, heart racing. Shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes that made me doubt my own vision. In my most feverish moments, I recalled the antiquary's figure not only in the shop, but also in moments from my earliest memories, standing behind a neighbor's gate, or appearing at the end of a corridor at my childhood home, except that home was across an ocean, and my earliest memories should be free from any stranger. Yet there he was, clad in that same long coat. Suddenly I questioned the authenticity of all my recollections. Had he been quietly planting himself in my life, siphoning bits of my identity like a silent parasite? I grew determined to confront him and end this nightmare. Through a contact at the local archives, I discovered that the antiquary's shop had apparently been registered under various names for centuries, always offering rare curiosities connected to vanished explorers and scholars. A wave of dread nearly doubled me over. My lungs burned as I struggled to breathe. Why hadn't anyone exposed this before? Or were they too consumed by the same forgetfulness that was now devouring me? One late afternoon, I walked through the winding alleys again, guided more by instinct than memory, until I found that weathered door. This time, it stood ajar. Inside, the dim lighting revealed shelves lined with an impossible array of relics spanning hundreds of years. Tools, journals, maps, and bizarre objects that seemed to hum with stored knowledge. My palms were slick with sweat as I ventured farther in. My heart thumped so violently it felt ready to burst from my chest. I felt his presence before I saw him. The antiquary stood near the back, behind the very table where I had first seen my items. His face was half hidden by shadow, and for a moment, an eerie shimmering seemed to surround him. My body went cold, and a shiver passed through me as though someone had dragged an icicle down my spine. My mouth was too dry to speak properly, so I could only manage a rasp, wanting to ask him who, no, what, he truly was. He inclined his head, as though recognizing my unspoken question. He gestured with a slender hand toward a large ledger. Its pages glowed faintly, each holding the name of a missing person, along with an inventory of the objects they had left behind. My heart slammed in my chest when I glimpsed my own name scribbled near the bottom. Next to it, my newly acquired artifacts were listed in meticulous handwriting. My knees felt weak, and I nearly collapsed. My breath came in shallow puffs, and I could hardly catch it. I realized, with stark horror, that I was on the path to becoming another entry in this living archive, a knowledge source for him to devour. I don't recall running out of that shop, only the sensation of panic spurring me forward. The setting sun bathed the streets in a sickly orange light, and my ears rang with the pounding of my pulse. My lungs burned from sprinting, each rasp of air shredding my throat, but adrenaline kept me moving. I have no memory of how long I ran, only that I ended up near the waterside, hunched over a stone wall, gasping in great gulps of briny air. In the days that followed, I struggled with an overpowering urge to return to the shop. The artifacts still call to me, whispering in the night, but I've locked them away in a trunk I keep in a storage unit on the outskirts of the city. My memory has slowly stabilized, although there are vast patches of my life that remain elusive, Sometimes when I recall childhood moments, I see that dark coat in the background, and I can't be sure if it's a real recollection or a product of my fractured mind. There are times when I question if I've merely woven a grand hallucination from exhaustion and obsession, but my gut churns whenever I consider that possibility. The fear is too vivid, the shadows too persistent, the sense of being watched too visceral to dismiss. My heart rate spikes each time a floorboard creaks behind me. I can't deny the stale voice that lingers on the edge of hearing, uttering my name in the hush of late-night silence. Though I escape that shop, I feel its pull whenever I pass by an antique store or see a sign offering rare curios. It's as if an invisible thread connects us, and if I were to follow it, I'd find him again, there in the darkness, waiting, ledger open, ready to record every piece of who I am. To this day, my breath still hitches when I see an old compass or a brass astrolabe, certain I'll discover more symbols that match the ones locked inside my blurred memories. I have told no one the complete story. Even now, writing it down makes my pulse pound and a cold sweat trickle down my back. The horrifying truth is that I'm never entirely alone. The antiques still whisper when the night is quiet enough, explaining how the antiquary craves not just objects, but the knowledge, experiences, and even the souls of those who stumble into his domain. I feel the edges of my oldest recollections fraying further, as though the threads holding them together are snapping one by one. I remain in Lisbon for now, uncertain whether leaving would truly free me from the antiquary's grasp. Part of me hopes that by staying near, I can keep watch, prevent him from collecting more unsuspecting souls. But another part fears that each day here tightens the cords binding me to him. Sometimes, in the faint light before dawn, I recall something from my childhood, a face, a place, or a dear friend, and then sense a dark figure overshadowing it, stealing away the details before I can fully grasp them. It is an oppression I live with constantly, one that makes every moment of introspection a potential trap. I have no illusions that I defeated him by running. He is ancient, cunning, and patient, feeding on the memories of those who stray too close to the secrets he guards. I wonder how much longer my mind can hold out, how many more nights I can bear the whispers seeping through locked trunks, creeping under my door, telling me of lives consumed and stories unfinished. To anyone who reads this, I cannot offer easy solace or a clean resolution. My heart still races, my fingers still tremble, and my throat tightens with dread each time I recall that final glimpse of the ledger. A persistent question haunts me. Am I merely a footnote waiting to be recorded, or can I break free from the antiquary's spectral grasp? Every night as darkness wraps around Lisbon, I stare at the flickering shadows on my walls and wonder whether tomorrow will be the day my memories finally slip away for good, leaving me with nothing but a lingering sense of loss and the echo of his hushed voice etched into my soul. Story 7. A sudden bolt of lightning cracked the sky as if splitting the entire mountain range in half. I felt a surge of dread course through me even before I had taken a single step into that isolated alpine refuge. The wooden structure looked deceptively welcoming, a solitary cabin perched on a craggy outcrop, as if stitched into the side of the mountain by force rather than design. Something about the place radiated a quiet menace, like an unspoken warning carried on the frigid wind. From the moment I arrived, I sensed I might have stumbled upon a place far more perilous than any treacherous peak I had ever climbed. I came here to recover. The climbing accident that nearly shattered my legs 3 months earlier ended my expedition prematurely and left me craving silence. The mountainous region promised a chance to rebuild my stamina in the thin alpine air, far from the bustle of city hospitals and crowded rehabilitation centers. Renting the remote refuge felt like the perfect remedy for my battered body and restless spirit. I remember contacting the owner over a patchy phone connection. It was a brief conversation. He didn't say much, only that the refuge was old but reliable, and that it would be wise to lock up after dark. There was no direct warning about storms or anomalies, only a vague mention that the area sometimes experienced unique weather patterns at night. The trek to the refuge was punishing. My lungs, still weak, burned from the altitude, and my legs protested with each step. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk had already settled into the valleys below. The sun's dying rays streaked the jagged peaks in brilliant oranges and reds, a final show of beauty before darkness claimed the range. I noticed how silent everything was. The typical cries of mountain birds were absent. Even the wind seemed hesitant to blow, as though it too were bracing for something that arrived with metronomic precision every night. At first, the interior looked as I expected from an old alpine shelter. A single main room with a stone fireplace, a handful of candles, and an antique lantern. An adjoining smaller room housed a rudimentary bed with a heavy wool blanket. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, almost as if it were trying to speak. The thick smell of dust and ancient timber filled my nostrils, though there was a sharper undertone, something metallic, like old blood or rusty iron. I told myself it must be just the dampness seeping through the walls. I had set my belongings down when I glimpsed the cabin's clock, 9:58 p.m. My heart skipped. I recalled the owner had advised me to pay attention to the weather around 10 o'clock, yet I wasn't fully prepared for what followed. Like clockwork, the first rumble of thunder rolled through the sky at precisely 10 p.m. The cabin trembled on its foundation, sending a shudder up my spine. I thought it was just an intense alpine storm, but then the lights flickered, the flames in the fireplace danced in erratic spirals, and I felt a static hum press into my ears. I forced myself to breathe slowly, telling my panicked mind that storms come and go. However, this wasn't a normal downpour. Lightning rattled the windows with rhythmic bursts, and the thunder followed not in random intervals but in an almost musical sequence. Fear crawled over my skin like a colony of ants when I checked my watch and saw exactly 10:33 p.m., the moment the storm ended. It was too precise. In a lifetime of high-altitude climbing, I had never encountered weather so punctual. My pulse pounded in my ears. My breath came in ragged gasps. I realized my body was soaked in sweat, and the cabin felt unnaturally still again. The storm had started exactly on the hour, lasted exactly 33 minutes, and then vanished. I remember thinking that this was more than a meteorological oddity. It felt orchestrated. I couldn't shake the uneasy sensation that somewhere, something, had set a clock for this. Over the next few days, I tried to dismiss these storms as bizarre but harmless. My daily routine of physical therapy demanded my attention. I performed careful exercises, stepping in place and stretching my injured leg. Though the local grocery store was hours away, I had brought enough supplies to last at least a few weeks. Sometimes I caught fleeting impressions of movement in my peripheral vision, a blur at the edge of my sight near the windows, or a faint flicker in the fireplace's reflection. Each time I turned around, I found nothing. Perhaps it was stress or leftover trauma from the accident. Perhaps it was a byproduct of isolation. Then, on the fifth night, the storm arrived like a thunderous hammer at precisely 10 p.m. As I watched, the color of the air changed. The candlelight became a sickly green. The shadows on the walls became elongated figures that seemed to twitch in the corners of my eyes. I heard the floorboards groan underfoot in the adjoining room, but I was alone. My body trembled as the possibility of an intruder crossed my mind. When I finally summoned the courage to check, I found the small bedroom strangely altered. The bed looked unmade, the sheets torn, and the walls seemed older, with peeling wallpaper and deep gouges in the wooden beams. It was as if I had stepped back into a forgotten era. My chest tightened. I could taste adrenaline in the back of my throat. I retreated, slamming the door and nearly stumbling over my own feet. When the storm ended at 10:33 p.m., I cautiously opened the door again. The bedroom was back to normal, the bed neatly made, the wallpaper non-existent, just bare wooden planks that had been there before. I had a surge of relief, followed by the stabbing certainty that something beyond normal comprehension was happening. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every distant scrape of wind against stone, jolted me awake in panic. In the week that followed, each nightly storm unleashed a new layer of horror. Once, I opened the front door during the storm to find the refuge's porch leading into a hallway. Not a porch, but a hallway full of flickering electric lights, with floor tiles that belonged in a 1970s building. I could smell chemicals, like a hospital corridor. The flicker of lights gave me a glimpse of shapes at the far end, figures that turned their faces in my direction. My heart thundered. Sweat poured down my neck. For a split second, I locked eyes with something that had my own features, only twisted as if in pain or madness. I slammed the door shut, the doorknob rattling in my shaking hand. When I opened it again at 10:34 p.m., the hallway was gone, replaced by the familiar view of a small wooden porch facing the dark horizon of mountains. I became convinced the storms were tearing holes in reality. The isolation pressed in on me. No phone signal, no easy way to get off the mountain at night, and my injured leg preventing me from making a rapid descent, even if I wanted to escape immediately. During brief daytime hikes to gather firewood, I found no neighbors. It was just me in that menacing cabin. My only respite was the knowledge that so far the refuge consistently returned to normal once the 33-minute storm ended. But that reassurance eroded quickly when I discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Inside lay an old, weathered notebook. Someone had scrawled pages of observations, many dated decades ago. The notes described storms at 10 p.m., lasting 33 minutes, always bringing visions of alternate timelines. The writer mentioned having glimpsed the cabin in states of ruin, in flames, even submerged in swirling water. One hurried sentence read, "The 100th storm completes the convergence. If you don't find your original cabin by then, you're stuck." My lungs felt compressed as if the air in the room had run out. My hands shook while turning the pages. Further scribblings talked about dimensional bleed, fractured timelines, and a perpetual labyrinth. Whoever wrote this had lived through the same phenomena I was experiencing, and they had vanished, leaving only this warning behind. My reality shifted from curiosity to mortal urgency. I was around the 50th storm, according to the notebook's pattern. That left less than 50 more nights before the dreaded 100th event. The very thought made my stomach twist in knots. My heart pounded so loud I sometimes had to cover my ears just to stop the roaring in my head. I started planning my days around how to investigate the cabin without losing my sanity. Each night at 10 p.m., the cabin changed, connecting to other versions of itself. I might step through a door and find a corridor where every wall was scratched and battered, or a room filled with rotting furniture. Sometimes I encountered glimpses of myself, hunched in corners or pacing, each version pale and drawn, as though caught in a personal nightmare. My skin would break out in goosebumps. Sweat dampened my collar. The worst part was hearing them breathe in sync with me, chest rising and falling with identical panic. Even recalling it now makes my throat clench. One evening, in the midst of the storm's fury, I forced myself to explore beyond the initial rooms. My logic was simple. If the cabin existed in multiple realities, there might be an original timeline where everything was stable. In that version, perhaps the storms never started, or maybe they ended for good. My plan was half-baked, driven by desperation. Heart hammering, I opened a door that normally led to a small storage room. Instead, I found a flight of stairs leading downward into darkness. My entire body tensed. There had never been a basement in this cabin. Each step reverberated with a hollow echo. It smelled of wet earth and decay. The deeper I went, the more my head spun. A disorienting sense of vertigo nearly sent me tumbling. My injured leg ached with each step, but I pressed on, forced to rely on the flickering beam of my flashlight. Down there, I discovered a cramped room lined with shelves of dusty canned goods. A single battered table stood in the center, covered in candle wax and scraps of paper. Strange symbols and rough sketches of geometric shapes were carved into the tabletop. My breathing grew erratic. I could almost hear my pulse in my skull. I sensed movement in the corner. When I turned the flashlight, I caught sight of a figure hunched in a heavy coat, face hidden by shadows. I felt the hair on the back of my neck bristle, every inch of me screaming to run. But I remained, paralyzed by fear. The shape tilted its head slowly. I noticed the barest reflection of eyes that looked just like mine. Then the flashlight flickered, and the figure was gone. Panicking, I scrambled back upstairs, almost crashing into the door. By the time I emerged, the storm was ending. The door behind me led once more to the ordinary storage room. No stairs, no basement, just the expected wooden walls. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping. My lungs felt like they were on fire, a wave of trembling making my arms weak. The cabin had returned to normal, but I realized it was only normal for me. Every timeline had its own normal, and they were overlapping more violently each night. Daylight offered limited comfort. Occasionally, I'd read more of the notebook. It described a possible method to identify the true cabin. Something about a consistent imperfection in the wood grain of the front door. But the handwriting was smudged, and the instructions were incomplete. I noticed a distinct pattern on my own front door, a vertical knot that resembled a crescent moon. The problem was that, during the storms, countless alternate versions of that door existed, each with slight variations. Some lacked the knot, others had an extra scratch or even looked brand new. My mind raced with the possibility that each reality carried its own minuscule differences, and I had to find the exact match before I hit storm number 100. Time blurred. I kept track of each storm, my tally nearing 70. My nerves frayed. Sleep became a patchwork of nightmares and jolts awake. Each time the wind howled or the floor groaned, I'd shoot upright, drenched in sweat, heart hammering against my ribs. The sensation of being watched grew stronger. When I walked through the cabin during the day, I sensed unseen eyes following my every move. I caught myself whispering prayers or nonsense phrases, trying to cling to any sense of normality. The specter of losing my mind haunted me more than any broken bone ever had. On the 90th storm, I almost gave up. The cabin windows revealed swirling clouds that appeared more like black, writhing shapes than weather phenomena. For a moment, I stepped outside onto the porch and saw flickers of multiple skies overlapping. A daytime sky with a sickly green hue superimposed on the starry night. I felt my breath hitch, unable to draw enough air. The swirling intensities nearly pulled me in physically, as if the atmosphere itself had become a vortex. I retreated inside, shutting the door and pressing my back against it, heart pounding. The cabin hallway flickered with half a dozen versions of itself, each one an elongated, shadowy corridor leading to unknown horrors. I closed my eyes and waited. Minutes later, the thunder ceased abruptly, and the illusions vanished. Desperation replaced my fear by the time I reached storm 99. I had one final chance to find the real cabin. I clutched the notebook, having memorized the clue about the knot pattern. The storm came in full force, and I threw open the front door, stepping into chaos. Lightning illuminated countless cabins in a kaleidoscope of realities. Each door stood side by side, some battered, some pristine, all flickering. The wind roared, carrying distant echoes of footsteps and moaning timbers. My body trembled so violently that I nearly dropped my flashlight. Stalking through the labyrinth of doors, I looked for the unmistakable crescent knot in the wood grain. I don't know how many versions of that front door I passed, or how many twisted reflections of myself I glimpsed in the swirling darkness. My breath tore out of my lungs. Tears pricked my eyes from the sheer overload of terror. At last, I spotted the pattern. A single vertical knot shaped like a crescent, nearly identical to the one in my memory. I felt a surge of hope that pulsed in my veins. Fear gnawed at me. What if I was wrong? Heart thundering in my ears, I pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The cabin interior looked exactly as I remembered on my first day. The same worn rug, the fireplace with a small crack on the mantel, the bed in the corner neatly arranged. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:31 p.m. 2 more minutes until the storm ended. My breaths came shallow and fast. Sweat soaked my collar and ran down my temples. I steeled myself for the possibility of disappointment, but the clock ticked to 10:32, then 10:33, and the storm stopped with a final rumble of thunder. Nothing changed. The cabin stayed the same. Relief crashed over me in a wave so sudden my legs nearly gave out. I dropped to my knees, letting out a shaky exhalation. This had to be the right place. It felt right. No flickering walls, no overlapping realities. At dawn, I cautiously stepped outside. The mountain air felt crisp, untainted by the oppressive weight I had grown accustomed to. Though clouds hovered in the sky, there was no hint of the relentless storms. My entire body ached, and my knee throbbed, but a calm settled over me. A nagging unease lingered at the back of my mind, warning that I should hurry down the mountain before nightfall returned. Yet the cabin no longer exuded that sinister energy. It felt quiet, as though I truly had reclaimed the original timeline. Still, something was off. When I looked at the path winding down toward the valley, it seemed slightly unfamiliar. The terrain was the same shape, but some rocks and trees appeared in different places than I remembered. My stomach clenched. Was it just my anxious imagination, or a subtle sign that even if I'd found the original refuge, the world around it had shifted in imperceptible ways? My heart hammered again, a smaller echo of the terror I'd endured. I could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on my tongue, but I tried to steady my breathing. I told myself I was safe now, that the storms were gone for good. Yet as I began the slow descent, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains were watching me. The air seemed thick, as though everything was just a fraction of a second out of sync with my steps. I wondered if my successful quest had been too late or slightly flawed, leaving me in a version of reality close to my own, but not exact. Each shift of gravel underfoot made my pulse spike. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper warnings in my ear. The cabin's door creaked behind me, a final groan from a place perched on the edge of infinite realities. Despite the bright morning sun, the memory of green-tinted lightning and swirling corridors haunted my vision every time I blinked. I still don't know if I truly escaped, or if I merely walked into another layer of that never-ending maze. The storms no longer strike at 10 p.m., but sometimes, in the silence of night, I imagine I hear distant thunder. My heart leaps into my throat and my breathing goes ragged, convinced for an instant that I'm still trapped. Maybe I am. Maybe we can never truly leave a place where countless timelines converge. I keep the battered notebook tucked away in my pack. Even now, I catch myself thumbing through its worn pages, scanning for a clue I might have missed. Something tells me that once you've stepped into those overlapping realities, you carry them with you, like a phantom limb that refuses to let you forget. And in those moments of stillness, I feel the weight of every storm yet to come, pressing down on my chest, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never really be shut. Story 8. I still remember the first time I felt the atmosphere shift, as if the world had quietly slipped into a darker place without warning. My office lights buzzed overhead, giving off a dull yellow glow that seemed oddly sinister in the early evening. The hum of city traffic became a muffled dirge outside my window, and suddenly, I was hyper-aware of my own breathing, my own heartbeat, pulsing thick in my ears. It was like the air itself had turned stale, invading my lungs with a cold pressure that made me shiver. Every muscle in my body tensed, as though anticipating an intrusion I couldn't see or name. That was the beginning, the first clue that something had gone terribly off-kilter in my otherwise predictable life as an accountant. I had always prided myself on maintaining a strictly logical perspective. Spreadsheets and balance sheets were my realm. Numbers told clean, tidy stories: revenue, costs, assets, liabilities. So when I first came across the charismatic investor, the man I'll call Mr. Howard, I initially dismissed the faint, unsettling tug in my gut. A colleague had praised him, calling him a genius at generating high returns. There was the slightest tinge of cynicism in the man's voice when he introduced me to Mr. Howard, but he insisted it was simple jealousy at not having discovered this opportunity himself. I noted the uneasy glint in his eye and told myself it was only professional envy. I tried to ignore the slow twist of discomfort gathering in my stomach. When I met Mr. Howard at a networking event, he stood out in every conceivable way. He was tall, elegant, with immaculately styled hair that shone almost unnaturally under the overhead lights. His eyes were bright, a shade of green so vivid that they seemed to glow from within. He had an ageless face, neither youthful nor old. It was as though time had paused for him, leaving every feature perfectly suspended in an uncanny state of calm. The moment I shook his hand, I felt a shiver climb my spine. His grip was firm, but there was a strange electricity that pricked my skin. My heart thudded in my chest, and I tried to steady my breathing, blaming my reaction on the anxiety of being around someone of such stature. He offered me an opportunity that night, explaining that he handled private investments with astonishingly consistent and extraordinary returns. My chest tightened. Deep inside, part of me thought, this can't be real. There must be a catch. But I reasoned that maybe I was just being overly cautious. He radiated confidence, not in an ostentatious way, but with a soft power that made every word he said seem unquestionably true. From that point on, he would invite me to his offices for detailed presentations of his investment secrets. Even the building where we met each time gave me chills. It was old, with architectural flourishes from a previous century, tall pillars and gargoyles perched on the corners of the rooftop. At night, its corridors were poorly lit, exhaling stale air that seemed to whisper of endless nights and old secrets. My footsteps echoed, sounding unnervingly loud, as though the hallway itself tried to swallow the noise. Sometimes I would break into a cold sweat for no apparent reason. My shirt would cling to my back, and the stale odor of the place seemed to tighten around me like a noose. In those early meetings, Mr. Howard described his strategies for maximizing profit. It was mostly talk of leveraged trading, bonds, foreign exchanges, and some private equity deals. Yet beneath the banal financial jargon, there was a resonance, something almost predatory in the way he portrayed the energy of money. My pulse would race when I listened to him. The hairs on my neck would stand up, and I'd have to run my tongue across my dry lips to muster the confidence to continue taking notes. When he handed me the folder of documents, samples of successful transactions, I noticed an almost inaudible vibration emanating from them. It was not a physical hum, but something that seemed to reverberate in my chest. My heart began to pound, and my breath caught as I saw enormous returns scribbled across the statements. A rush of adrenaline coursed through me, but it wasn't the familiar excitement of a lucrative deal. It was more akin to the dreadful thrill of peering over the edge of a cliff. I tried to rationalize my impressions. Surely this was just an extreme reaction to the possibility of such massive earnings. The rational side of me insisted that no business was perfect, and that these numbers, though large, could be real with the right strategy. But the more time I spent with Mr. Howard, the more the intangible sense of dread grew. His posture was always calm, yet there was something static about it. His eyes never wavered. He spoke in a low, controlled tone that hung in the air even after his lips stopped moving. My nightmares soon began. I dreamed of rotting corridors and flickering lights where I could hear his voice reverberating, beckoning me onward. I would wake with my heart hammering, sweat chilling my skin, the taste of metal on my tongue. Eventually, he entrusted me with more significant tasks. He wanted me to manage the accounts of new investors coming in, ensuring they transferred large sums into specially created funds. The first time I combed through the official documentation, I found anomalies. Nothing overtly illegal, just subtle details that made no sense. Dates that didn't match, references to events that supposedly took place decades before Mr. Howard's public record indicated he'd even started the business. Intrigued, I dug deeper. Late at night, I'd be in the solitary glow of my desk lamp, scrolling through scanned archives. I found references to individuals whose names reappeared under different partnerships, but always with the same figure pulling the strings, a man who bore a striking resemblance to Mr. Howard. My breath would become uneven. I'd catch myself trembling and force my fingers to keep clicking through the endless pages. Was I hallucinating? Or was there truly a pattern emerging that spanned generations? The deeper I went, the more bizarre the findings. I uncovered an old ledger from the 1930s with a black and white photograph clipped inside. My blood turned to ice as I recognized that face. It was identical to the man I'd just met, the same grin, the same colorless but piercing stare. I felt my pulse pounding in my temples, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm me. I checked the back of the photo for any date, and it read 1932. Hastily, I flipped the pages of the ledger and saw more references to similar ventures, always involving large sums of money and a sudden decline in the health of the investors. My skin turned clammy, and cold sweat trickled down my spine. A stifling claustrophobia welled up in my chest, as if the walls were creeping inward, ready to smother me. I couldn't explain the photographic evidence in any rational way. Something unimaginable was at play. Every set of documents pointed to the same unsettling truth. Mr. Howard had been conducting the same scheme for over a century. My heart pounded so violently that it felt like it might burst. Sleep became nearly impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that unchanging face, that self-satisfied half-smile. I heard phantom whispers in the lonely corridors of my apartment building at night. I began to double-check my own reflection in the mirror, searching for signs of premature aging or a sallow complexion, frightened that I might somehow be the next victim. As the days went on, I noticed something alarming in the new clients who had recently signed with Mr. Howard. They appeared drained, bags under their eyes, their hair losing its luster, their skin turning pallid and thin. One man seemed to have acquired a noticeable stoop in the short span of a single week. Their expressions were dull, as though life itself had been siphoned away. My breathing grew sharp whenever I passed them in the hallway or caught a glimpse of them in the waiting area. It was like observing zombies moving mechanically from one place to another. Fear curdled in my stomach because I recognized the slow, methodical horror unfolding before me. It wasn't just money Mr. Howard extracted. He stole vitality, leaving husks in his wake. Late one evening, hunched over my desk under a single flickering fluorescent bulb, I made a breakthrough. I located a faint reference to something far older than the earliest ledger. It was a fragmentary record from 1875, involving a foreign bank. The text was archaic in style, but the gist was unmistakable. A man with the same impossible youth had orchestrated a transaction that left dozens of clients emptied and reliant on the man for their continued existence. My heart hammered. I was alone in the building, my ears straining against the silence. I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor, but when I peered through the crack of the office door, the space was deserted. Yet I could feel something there, a presence that prickled the back of my neck. I tasted fear in my mouth, bitter and metallic. I confronted Mr. Howard soon after, but indirectly. I mentioned the oddities in the accounts, the repeated names across decades, the strange photographs. My voice trembled, my palms were clammy, and I willed myself not to faint. He regarded me with disconcerting calm, his gaze unwavering, and he stated that I had stumbled onto the bigger plan. There was a moment when my entire body tensed, and I forgot to breathe. I wanted to ask him how it was possible, but the words lodged in my throat. My heart pounded so hard that it rattled in my ribcage like a caged animal. He explained in a measured tone that he had mastered the art of siphoning life essence through financial transactions. It was not a metaphor. Wealth was merely a conduit for the transfer of energy, and contracts, legal documents, and signatures created a binding channel through which he could pull vitality from his clients. My head spun. The office felt like it was spinning with me. My mind rebelled against his explanation, refusing to believe that such a monstrous practice could exist right under the nose of every regulator and financial watchdog. But there he stood, unfazed, offering me a chance to become his apprentice. I remember the dryness in my mouth so vividly that my tongue felt like sandpaper. My lungs forgot how to function, and for a second, black spots threatened to claim my vision. He insisted that since I had discovered his secret, I was the perfect candidate to continue his legacy. He explained that he had upheld this practice for as long as he could remember, periodically taking on new identities whenever suspicion grew too great. He made it clear that my involvement would ensure my own immunity. I would never need to worry about aging or about normal human limitations, if only I agreed to be part of his circle. In that moment, the walls felt as though they were leaning in, the overhead lights dimming as a wave of disorientation rocked me. My shirt stuck to my back, soaked with cold sweat. I wanted to escape, run anywhere, find a breath of fresh air far away from his suffocating presence. But his gaze pinned me in place. He told me to think carefully about it. He even revealed old photos, some I had already seen, others newly uncovered. In these photographs, he looked exactly as he did now, timeless and unblinking. His investors, always at his side at first, slowly appeared more and more decrepit in subsequent pictures until they vanished altogether. Those images burned themselves into my retinas. I could practically feel a cold breeze emanating from the still photos, a silent testament to the suffering they portrayed. As I stared, my own reflection in the polished surface of the table looked worn and exhausted, as if I too had already lost a fraction of my life force. In the days that followed, I became more paranoid than I ever thought possible. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to move in the corner of my vision. I heard faint creaking at my door at odd hours. My heart would race with a primal terror, and I'd hide in the bathroom, pressing myself against the cold tiles to calm down. My mind played tricks on me. I'd see dark shapes in the mirror behind my own reflection, or I'd wake up covered in sweat, convinced that Mr. Howard was standing at the foot of my bed. I wrestled with conflicting impulses. On one hand, the prospect of indefinite youth and power was sickeningly alluring. Imagine never worrying about the slow crawl of time and human frailty. But on the other hand, my stomach churned at the thought of what acceptance would mean. Enabling the same predatory scheme, devouring people's futures for personal gain. My sense of morality seemed to wither under the weight of such temptation. My anxiety grew so intense that I caught myself trembling in broad daylight, even among crowds of unsuspecting passers-by. I was certain he was watching me, sizing me up to see whether I would submit or reject his offer. One night I gathered my courage, or perhaps my desperation, and resolved to end my involvement. I packed my files, copied the documents onto multiple encrypted drives, and prepared to vanish from my job. The very act of stepping out of my office building after midnight felt like stepping into a predatory labyrinth. The air was thick, humid, and laced with malevolence. My body tensed as I heard a distant scraping sound, like nails on concrete. My heart hammered so wildly that I could hardly inhale. Every step I took down that deserted street reverberated in my ears. I felt sure that at any moment, something would clamp onto my shoulder from behind. Somehow, I reached my car and roared away, ignoring the red lights until I was far beyond the city. I tried to find solace in the knowledge that I'd escaped, at least for now. Yet even as I write these words, my hands are shaking. My reflection in the rearview mirror still looks haunted, as though I've lost something important I can never reclaim. An unfamiliar tension lines my face. I can't tell whether it's the stress or if I've already been touched by Mr. Howard's draining power. Sometimes my lungs feel constricted, like they don't inflate fully, and I have to swallow repeatedly to keep the panic at bay. I've abandoned my old life, but I feel the man's presence in every corner of my thoughts. At night, my heart still races at random intervals. My back is damp with sweat, my skin painfully cold, and there's a prickling behind my eyes that suggests I'm not truly alone. I keep checking the corners of my new apartment, half expecting him to materialize in the flicker of a malfunctioning light. Some days, I wonder if I should have accepted. The temptation gnaws at me like a persistent hunger, whispering that I could have gained immunity from this fear, that I could have stood on the other side of mortality, but I sense that would have required a sacrifice of my humanity. Even so, a seed of longing remains. I suspect that is his final curse, to haunt those who refuse, ensuring they can never find peace again. I don't know where Mr. Howard is now, perhaps behind another identity, securing fresh contracts with unsuspecting victims. Sometimes in the silence before dawn, I think I hear his voice, softly repeating the proposal he once made. My limbs go rigid, and my breath stalls in my chest. Adrenaline courses through me, and my heart thunders with the memory of his emerald gaze. I can still feel that dark promise vibrating in the air. All I can do is keep moving, keep running, and hope that my will remains strong enough to resist. But with every mile I put between us, the dread lingers. The nights are silent and endless, my teeth chattering in the face of an unseen horror that might resurface any minute. and I'm left with the terrible understanding that his offer was never really a question. Whether I like it or not, I've been marked by the knowledge of his existence. No matter where I go, that knowledge follows. My heart beats incessantly with a single, inescapable truth. He is still out there, waiting, watching, and the energy he harvests will sustain him for as long as he desires. And so, I continue onward with a gnawing dread, each day a burden on my frayed nerves. My flesh still prickles at every creak in the night, and my body trembles under the weight of a secret I can't outrun. It's a terror that has woven itself into my very existence, an unending vigilance that keeps me wide awake at the hour when most people rest. In those moments, I feel him closer than ever, like a silhouette in the corner of my eye. My sanity teeters on the edge, and I can't be certain if what I see is real or just a projection of my own fear. But one thing remains undeniable. His presence is a slow poison, sapping my peace even from afar. I can still sense him in the hush of the air, tasting the bitter tang of dread on my tongue, with my heart pounding an uneven rhythm that echoes a single damning truth. There is no true escape from Mr. Howard's legacy. Story 9. From the very first instant I stepped through the bent, rusted gates of the abandoned amusement park, an oppressive weight pressed against my chest. The air felt unnaturally cold, with an earthy scent that reminded me of stale popcorn and damp canvas. A weak wind whispered across the crumbling asphalt, making torn banners sway and snap against the skeletal frames of toppled stalls. My heart drummed hard, blood pulsing in my ears. Every step resonated with the uneasy crunch of debris underfoot, and I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, was watching me from the shadows. I had ventured into many forsaken places in my life as an urban photographer, but this location radiated a sense of wrongness from the outset. I had heard rumors about the amusement park, rumors of ghostly apparitions and time-lost illusions. The local folklore claimed that the park stood on the grounds of a once-famous traveling circus, run by a mysterious illusionist whose crowning performance was called the Suspended Eternity. People in nearby towns whispered about bizarre sightings, translucent figures wandering the old rides, laughter echoing when no one was inside. I chalked it up to supernatural gossip, typical of places left to rot. But something in those rumors pulled at me, maybe a perverse curiosity, or a desire to capture on film whatever strange energy lingered here. On that first visit, I remember the sky being dull gray, the sun hidden behind a thick slab of clouds. With each step deeper into the park, my breathing grew more labored, as though the atmosphere were laced with invisible pressure. The ticket booths at the entrance were shattered shells, windows punched out, the walls covered in fading posters. The path leading toward the central plaza of the park seemed uneven, as though the ground itself wanted to twist and contort. I felt adrenaline surge through me, that mix of excitement and mild terror I often got when entering a location that few dared to explore. I lifted my camera, scanning for interesting shots. Broken carousel horses lay strewn to one side, half buried in leaves. A roller coaster track towered overhead, silent and ominous like the rib cage of a giant metal beast. I could practically hear the ghosts of music that once played here, tinny calliope tunes that might have heralded illusions from the old circus. My hands trembled slightly as I took my first series of photographs, the shutter clicks echoing in the emptiness. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. Something about capturing these ruins felt transgressive, like I was stealing memories from a place that refused to let go of its past. The first odd detail revealed itself when I reviewed my shots later that night. My living room was dim, the only source of light coming from my laptop screen. As I clicked through the images, I noticed faint outlines in the background, a shape standing near the broken carousel, another near a dilapidated arcade stall. At first, I assumed it was dust or lens flare, but the silhouettes had distinct contours, almost like people paused mid-stride. My mouth went dry. I zoomed in, heart pounding, and I swore I could make out translucent faces caught in fleeting expressions of anticipation or delight. It unsettled me deeply, but I also felt compelled to return. I told myself it was all an optical glitch, a trick of the mind. Yet a lingering sense of dread kept me up that night. On my second visit, the weather was even gloomier, and the park looked darker than before. The sky threatened rain, a thick humidity hanging over the twisted steel rides. As I wandered past battered food carts, a subtle flicker in my peripheral vision made me freeze. My pulse quickened, and I held my breath. When I looked directly, there was nothing there, just a battered balloon stand with half-deflated shapes rotting on the ground. I convinced myself it was nerves, that I was simply on edge because of the odd figures in my photos. My stomach churned, and I felt a spike of nausea that passed as quickly as it came. I snapped more pictures, capturing angles of the Ferris wheel, the old entrance gates, the main walkway lined with rusted lampposts. As I packed up my gear, an uneasy sensation of being followed became unbearable. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and each footstep behind me seemed to mimic my own, just half a beat off. I spun around abruptly. No one was there. The rational part of my mind insisted it was wind or my own echo, but my heart thundered as though I'd just escaped a predator's gaze. With a shaky exhale, I rushed out of the park. When I got home, I noticed something startling in the new pictures. The outlines were clearer now, as though my lens had managed to capture them more fully. I saw entire groups of translucent people waiting in line for rides, clutching admission tickets, their mouths formed in wide smiles. But even more perplexing was the condition of the park itself in the photographs. Where my memory recalled broken scaffolding and peeled paint, the images showed fewer signs of decay. The Ferris wheel looked stable. The roller coaster's metal tracks gleamed faintly. My own recollection insisted the place was still in shambles, but the camera suggested a bizarre restoration in progress. My throat tightened. I started to suspect that the illusions rumored to haunt this place were more than just ghost stories. Something was rewriting reality, at least inside my camera. The next few weeks were dominated by sleepless nights. I felt drawn back to the park, despite the gnawing fear in my gut. The air in my apartment tasted stale, and I found myself constantly glancing at the photographs, half expecting the translucent figures to move when I wasn't looking. My body was constantly tense, as if perpetually waiting for some unknown threat. I had trouble swallowing, my mouth parched, and my hands would break out in a cold sweat whenever I thought about returning. But the compulsion was undeniable. On my third visit, the moment I passed through the entrance, I became aware of an overpowering sense of déjà vu. The battered signs, the twisted fences, everything seemed a little less broken, a little more intact. My palms felt damp against my camera. I tried to reassure myself that I was only imagining this. Maybe the park wasn't as ruined as I remembered. Maybe I'd been exaggerating its decay in my head. But then I noticed the carousel. Previously, it had been missing half its horses. Now more of them were present, though chipped and dull. I reminded myself to breathe, inhaling the stale breeze that tasted vaguely of burnt sugar. My heartbeat pounded so fiercely I could feel it in my throat. I recalled overhearing a local historian mention the old circus that had once pitched its tents here. The main attraction, they said, was an enigmatic illusionist, famous for suspending spectators in a pocket of time, letting them momentarily break free from the normal flow of reality. The rumored act was called the Suspended Eternity, and it attracted crowds who wanted to experience a single, perfect moment, prolonged. According to the historian, something dreadful happened on the day the circus first opened in this location. The event itself was never fully explained, but from that day forward, the traveling show disbanded, and eventually, the amusement park was erected over the same grounds. In the deeper recesses of the park, I found cracked remnants of what might have been the circus ring. A lopsided big-top frame stood near the center, battered canvas fluttering in the wind. I wondered if that was where the illusions had once taken place. My heart hammered so hard I felt faint. My breath came in ragged gasps, as if the air were thickening around me. I attempted to calm myself by focusing on my photography, but the camera felt heavier, as though it resisted being lifted. A faint sound reached my ears, what seemed like distant laughter. It was brittle and echoing, as if traveling through decades to reach me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The laughter tapered off, replaced by the creaking of metal structures swaying overhead. That was when I noticed movement beyond the toppled fences, shapes drifting slowly. They had a soft glow, like lamplight seen through fog. My stomach churned, and I clutched my camera tighter, uncertain whether to lift it or turn and run. Eventually, I found the courage to snap a few shots, but every shutter click felt like a hammer blow to my nerves. My entire body trembled. I was drenched in cold sweat, my lungs straining for each breath. After several shots, a wave of dizziness nearly overwhelmed me. The edges of my vision blurred, and I had to kneel on the cracked asphalt to steady myself. In that moment, it felt like the park itself was pulling me deeper, refusing to let me leave. My camera strap dug painfully into my shoulder, almost as if the device were trying to anchor me in place. I remembered a brief conversation with a groundskeeper I'd run into months before. He had warned me that every photo taken inside the park fed something ancient and hungry. He never clarified what exactly he meant, but his words haunted me now. My attempts at rationalizing the situation collapsed. I felt a stifling paranoia, convinced that the illusions were creeping into me. The dryness in my mouth grew worse. My tongue felt like sandpaper. Even the simplest act of swallowing became a labor. Returning home that evening, I forced myself to look at the new photos. My pulse raced the moment I opened the first file. The park appeared almost vibrant, with garish neon signs glowing and rides in mid-rotation. The translucent figures were so vivid now that I could see the strain in their excited expressions, as if they were caught in a single second of anticipation. Even more disturbing, I spotted my own silhouette among them in one of the shots, a faint outline near the Ferris wheel. It was an impossible angle, as if I had photographed myself from behind. My insides twisted. The rational side of my brain insisted I must have triggered a timer, or maybe captured my reflection in some metallic surface. But the panic in my chest told me something else was at work. I spent the night pacing my apartment, my mind circling the same questions. I felt caged. My heart wouldn't settle, beating in an unsteady rhythm that threatened to burst. Every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me jump, and I imagined those ghostly figures inching their way across my walls. I could hardly sleep. When I did manage to doze off, I dreamed of the park's laughter and light. In my dream, I was trying to leave, but each photograph I took weighed me down more, until I was moving in slow motion, as if my legs were encased in cement. Eventually, I realized I had to either finish this or let it consume me. Early the next morning, I returned to the park. The atmosphere felt electric, thick with tension. The place looked different again. The sun's rays filtered through a shifting mist, illuminating spots of fresh color on the rides. Posters that I remembered as torn were now partially intact, featuring images of an elegant figure wearing a top hat. My stomach clenched. I could almost see the illusions swirling in the air, glimmers of a carnival that refused to fade away. Venturing closer to the dilapidated big-top frame, I felt a powerful sense of vertigo. Each step forward felt like stepping across two different times, one present and one long past. My breathing grew fast and erratic, and my palms left sweat marks on my camera. I paused just inside the big top and looked around. The scattered remains of circus seats and old crates were still there, but superimposed over them, I could glimpse the phantom shapes of a performance that never ended. I saw a stage, luminous in the haze. I felt my heartbeat thudding behind my eyes, a lightness in my head that bordered on a panic attack. In that moment, I understood that the illusions here were not mere ghosts. They were loops of time, fragments of an event linked to the suspended eternity. Those who had come seeking a magical thrill were now bound in a permanent cycle of expectancy, replaying their fleeting moment of joy over and over. And the more photographs I took, the more I fed that cycle, allowing the illusions to bleed further into my reality. The entire structure of the park seemed to live off the energy captured in the camera lens, regaining life one snapshot at a time. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming urge to snap another photograph. My hand moved on its own, raising the camera to my eye. Alarm jolted through me. and I fought the compulsion. My vision began to waver. The shapes around me glowed brighter. My heart hammered so violently that pins and needles spread through my arms. I was on the brink of hyperventilating, gasping for air that felt thick as syrup. Somewhere in the haze, I sensed the presence of the illusionist, tall and imposing, though I couldn't fully make out the features. It felt as though he was beckoning me to join the endless show. Refusing to give in, I forced myself to turn away. My legs felt like they were trudging through mud. I stumbled out of the big top, nearly falling when I reached the open air. The weight on my chest released slightly. I kept my camera pressed against me, my fingers trembling. The laughter and the faint carnival music grew distant, but I knew the illusions were still inside, waiting. I made a final push toward the exit, legs quivering with each step. My breath hissed through clenched teeth, and a clammy chill drenched my entire body. I felt the park's invisible grip pulling at my back, as if 100 unseen hands were trying to yank me into their timeless festival. I refused to look behind me, adrenaline fueling every movement. My vision blurred with tears of sheer panic, and my heart felt too big for my chest. When I finally broke free of the gates, a wave of nausea hit me, forcing me to double over and fight the urge to vomit. The moment I looked up, I realized I was still clutching my camera. A dread settled in my stomach. Part of me wanted to fling it away, to destroy it, to remove any trace of those photos. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. My entire body trembled, and my face burned with the heat of leftover terror. I told myself I would never return. In the days that followed, I avoided looking at my images. I wanted to sever all connection to the place. Yet, sometimes, I found myself staring at the camera on my desk, that faint feeling of compulsion gnawing at the corners of my mind. I could recall, in excruciating detail, the electric hum of the air in that amusement park, the illusions that shimmered just out of sight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw translucent figures waiting in line for a ride that could never end. My heart still pounded at the memory. Then one night, while half asleep, I heard muffled carousel music drifting through my window. My breath seized in my throat. It made no sense. There was no functioning carousel for miles. My heart thundered in my ears, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, convinced I'd hear laughter or the distant crash of a cymbal next. But the room was silent. For several minutes, my body remained on edge, lungs pumping air in ragged gasps. I don't know if I truly escaped the loop, or if I've merely postponed the inevitable. The park exists in a suspended moment, and each new photo taken there only gives it more vitality. Something about that place, about the old circus illusions, refuses to let go of any visitor who dares trespass. Though I manage to walk out, I can't say I'm entirely free. On most days, I feel a trembling undercurrent in my nerves, a subtle knowledge that any attempt to revisit those photographs might pull me back in. Occasionally, I feel a tug at my conscious mind, a whisper urging me to return and document the park's renewal. My breathing turns shallow whenever I sense it, as if the memory of that suffocating air has come rushing back. I do everything I can to resist, to keep myself tethered to the present. Yet the uncertain dread remains, an open question as to whether I truly broke the cycle, or am just one more translucent shape waiting in line for a ride that never ends. Even now, I wake from uneasy dreams coated in cold sweat, my pulse racing. In those dreams, I see the illusions more vividly than ever. Lines of guests, arms raised in excitement, smiles frozen in time. No one speaks, but the air crackles with anticipation. The moment always hovers on the brink of something cataclysmic, but it never concludes. And as I stand among them with my camera, I realize that if I click the shutter even once, I might never find my way out again. So I force myself to lower the camera, my hands shaking, and my heart struggling to keep its pace. I haven't yet destroyed my photographs from that place, nor have I shared them. Part of me thinks it's best if they remain locked away, so they cannot draw anyone else toward that cursed park. Another part of me wonders if the images themselves will gradually morph, reflecting a timeline that is no longer bound to me. I avoid checking. The risk is too great, the fear too real. The memory of that metallic taste in the air, the feeling of hands pulling at my shoulders, and the sight of my own half-translucent figure captured from behind are more than enough to keep me from returning. So I carry on with my life, always looking over my shoulder whenever I pass by old carnival posters or hear the distant notes of circus music. A sense of lingering unease curls around me at all times, like a fog that refuses to lift. And whenever I feel compelled to pick up my camera for the next urban exploration, I hesitate a fraction of a second, remembering the park that seemed to rebuild itself through each snap of my lens, remembering how close I came to being trapped in someone else's eternal mirage. That knowledge weighs on me every day, an uncomfortable presence at the back of my mind. And although I'm on the outside now, I've seen enough to know the park never really lets go. It's always there, suspended in its perfect, horrifying moment, beckoning trespassers with promises of spectacle and illusions. In my weakest moments, I almost feel it calling me back. I don't answer. I can't. All I can do is carry the dread within me, hoping it never finds a way to reach out and pull me back into its endless loop. Story 10. I still feel the damp chill of that cave clinging to my bones, as though the darkness we encountered seeped into my marrow and decided to stay there. Even now, my fingertips grow numb whenever I recall the moment we realized we were no longer in a place governed by any normal rules. Thunder roared outside in the blackness of the storm-stricken night, but it was the echo inside that hollow chamber of stone that truly unsettled me. A muffled resonance hinting at realities best left unspoken. I remember leading my group of fellow mountaineers, 5 of us in total, through a winding trail beneath the raging skies. Sharp wind whipped my face, and lightning illuminated the craggy peaks like fleeting beacons. We had been eager to conquer one last climb, but the weather turned hostile with alarming speed. Sheets of rain pounded us, forming rivulets that carved new paths in the mud, threatening to wash us away. When we stumbled upon the cave entrance, partially hidden behind jagged boulders, it felt like a miraculous shelter. At first, the opening seemed small, barely enough room for one person to squeeze through at a time. But after crawling a few yards, we found ourselves in a larger chamber. The air inside was stale, cold, and somehow thicker than the storm-lashed breeze outside. I switched on my headlamp, shining its narrow beam across the slick walls. The stone glistened with moisture, but beyond that sheen, I noticed faint shapes I couldn't yet decipher. We moved in further, forced by the shrieking winds that tore at our backs. Each person pressed themselves against the rough interior walls, trying to find a balance between claustrophobia and the desire to escape the ferocity outside. My pulse hammered in my ears, each beat accompanied by a deeper sense of dread I couldn't rationalize. I tried to reassure myself it was just the adrenaline from the storm. Others in the group muttered similar sentiments in tense whispers, hoping that after a few hours, the tempest might subside and we could resume our descent. I offered them as much comfort as I could muster, though my voice felt hollow, trapped in a throat that seemed too tight. Soon, I noticed distinct drawings etched across the cavern walls, simple silhouettes at first glance. I stepped closer, letting the headlamp's glow reveal more detail. Images of people with elongated limbs, some standing, others hunched as though carrying supplies. At first I thought these might be ancient depictions of hunters or travelers, but the longer I stared, the more bizarre details emerged. Several of the figures had thick lines around their torsos and legs, reminiscent of modern harnesses. One silhouette appeared to be wearing a backpack with straps that angled down the shoulders exactly like the ones we used. A chill ran up my spine, a tingling sensation that made my skin prickle. Despite my attempts to remain composed, my breathing quickened, shallow and hot against the cool cave air. I glanced at my own gear. It was impossible not to see the eerie resemblance. My heart thudded harder as I recognized a series of small, circular markings near one figure's head, just where my headlamp was positioned. The others joined me, eyes wide, confusion etched into every drawn breath. No one said much aloud. Instead, they looked to me for an explanation. I merely shook my head, the dryness in my mouth making it impossible to form words. In the flickering arcs of our flashlights, we followed the cave paintings deeper. More images lined the corridor as it twisted beyond the initial chamber. I noticed a pattern. Each sequence of paintings seemed to show a progression of figures traveling through the cave's passages, encountering something, then pushing onward. It was like a storyboard of our own steps, a prediction or a reflection, I couldn't tell which. There were even streaks of bright color, a rare find in such ancient rock art that unnervingly matched the hues of some of our jackets. At one point, my friend, one of the more inquisitive members of the team, mentioned quietly that it seemed the images had only recently been etched, though it made no logical sense. The lines were crisp, unweathered by centuries. No patina or dust obscured them. It was as though they had just been created. His tone was hushed and urgent, betraying the anxiety we all felt. A deeper tunnel beckoned us onward. It was narrower, forcing us into single file. The floor was slippery, and each boot step sent echoes bouncing off the walls. Every time I inhaled, I caught a faint whiff of decay, an odd, sour smell that made my stomach lurch. The group pressed closer together, and with each passing minute, my mind raced with possibilities that only intensified my unease. Eventually, our flashlights revealed a chamber that opened up considerably. The ceiling soared above us, its vault-like surface pocked with stalactites. In the center lay an uneven mound. My heart fluttered with a sickening rush of fear. I could already see shapes, human-like outlines. They were covered in dust, cobwebs, and a curious, crystalline substance that shimmered under our lights. Approaching cautiously, my heart beat so loud it seemed to rattle my skull. I soon realized these figures were us, or more accurately, they looked exactly like us. Each shape had the same gear, the same approximate build, even the same scuffs and scratches on their clothing. Their skin was withered, though, drawn taut over faces that appeared locked in vacant expressions. Their eyes, half open, gave the unsettling impression that they might be blinking in slow motion, just on the cusp of awareness. A wave of intense nausea struck me. It felt like I was staring at a grotesque reflection in a mirror that warped time. No one dared step too close, but we circled the figures trying to make sense of the impossible. I kept thinking my eyes were deceiving me, that some trick of the cave environment was generating illusions. And yet, the details were too exact to dismiss. I recall one of the group members remarking that the clothing had a pattern only sold in the last few seasons. A brand new design, impossible to have existed millennia ago. He said it in a hushed, cracking voice. Another person in the team began trembling so badly that their flashlight beam jerked wildly across the walls. A surge of claustrophobic horror gripped me. My lungs felt compressed, as though the weight of eons pressed down on them. My chest constricted, and I had to fight to keep from gasping. The others seemed similarly affected. Their faces drew pale in the faint glow, eyes darting about as if searching for any rational anchor. That was when I noticed more paintings, this time in the chamber itself. They covered the far wall, depicting the same figures we had seen before, but continuing the sequence. In these new scenes, a lone figure knelt near the others, engaged in some kind of artistic act. It was painting, or carving, or perhaps doing both. Next to this figure, strange symbols spiraled outward, giving me an impression of infinite repetition. A creeping realization settled into my mind. The person who made these paintings was one of us, or had once been. Perhaps the paintings stretched back through countless cycles. I recall a vivid spike of panic as I considered the possibility that time in this cave did not follow a straight line. The dryness of my mouth turned into a sharp ache, and I could almost taste the bitterness of my fear. We studied the final images more closely and discovered an indication, almost like a map, leading deeper into the cave. Though every fiber of my being warned me to stay put, a strange compulsion tugged me forward. It was as if the cave itself was guiding us, or maybe the paintings were. As we inched along, each step feeling heavier than the last, fresh markings appeared on the walls. They hadn't been there moments before. I clutched my flashlight, which trembled in my sweaty hand, and peered at the new figures. They depicted the moment we had just lived, capturing our stunned expressions, the position of our arms, the tilt of our heads. My breath caught in my throat. The next panel showed us continuing onward, but it also showed something else. A single figure splitting off from the group. Their silhouette was dwarfed by the darkness, as though stepping into a black void. I heard an uneasy stirring among my companions. A few asked if we should turn back, find some other way out, but the paintings displayed no alternative route. Every path drawn seemed to lead to the same grim conclusion. I forced my feet forward, ignoring the frantic pounding of my heart and the cold sweat forming at my temples. The tunnel became narrower once again. My shoulders brushed against the slick rock, sending cold shivers down my arms. A scraping sound, like metal against stone, echoed ahead. We moved cautiously until we reached another small alcove. Inside, we saw a crude paint mixture set on the floor, pigments that were suspiciously similar to the ones coloring our jackets and harnesses, along with a rudimentary brush carved from bone or wood. I felt a sudden jolt of recognition. This was a station for creating the paintings. The strangest part was the sense of residual warmth that clung to the area, as though someone had just been there. My pulse throbbed behind my eyes. I could hear nothing but the blood pounding in my ears and my own ragged breaths. Another wave of that sour odor washed over me, intensifying my lightheadedness. Around the alcove, the story continued. One panel showed a figure alone, placing their hand against the wall in a gesture that looked both desperate and resigned. Another panel depicted that figure painting or chiseling the timeline, a chronicle for the next iteration. I could barely stand to look at it. It felt like gazing into a destiny we had no power to resist. Suddenly, the ground beneath us rumbled. An avalanche of vibrations shook the corridor, and I stumbled, barely managing to keep my balance. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the walls groaned as though alive. My group members yelled, their voices echoing into a cacophony of panic. In that moment, I knew we were close to being sealed in, perhaps forever. We hurried on, discovering yet another chamber. This one smaller and lit by a strange, phosphorescent fungus clinging to the walls. It cast an otherworldly glow that throbbed like a living heartbeat. Under that spectral light, the paintings reached their conclusion. In the final images, 4 figures exited the cave, while a 5th remained, kneeling before the walls. The lines were thick and pronounced, as if emphasizing the inevitability of this outcome. A heavy knot formed in my gut. My body trembled with the realization that one of us was meant to stay. My mind raced. If we defied the paintings, would we be trapped in an endless loop? Was that the meaning behind those disturbing, mummified echoes of ourselves? Forms that never truly escaped the cycle, locked in a state beyond normal existence? A creeping paranoia took hold, urging me to watch my companions closely. I could sense that none of them wanted to voice what we all understood. Someone would have to remain as the caretaker of this place, to document our story, to preserve the cycle for whoever arrived next. My breath felt like fire in my chest. The most horrifying part was not just the notion of being left behind, but the certainty that this was the only route to freedom for the others. I could sense eyes on me, even though no one said anything outright. I was the guide, the one responsible for bringing us here. I thought back to the figures we saw, the painting station, the ancient timeline that seemed to record each attempt to escape. My heart beat so violently that dark spots danced at the corners of my vision. Then I recalled the final image, 4 leaving, 1 staying. My chest clenched. Despite the fear gripping me, or perhaps because of it, I felt a grim acceptance. I had guided my team to safety countless times before in different mountains, different storms. Maybe this was no different. Maybe this was the price demanded by an impossible place, by a phenomenon that existed outside normal time. As I stepped forward, the group reacted in hushed shock. I assured them, as calmly as possible, that I would find a way out after they were safe. Deep down, I suspected there was no second chance once I took on the role of the painter. I tried to keep my composure, ignoring the dryness in my throat and the tremor in my legs. Through shallow, rapid breaths, I motioned for them to head back, to follow the path that seemed to lead to the outside world as depicted in the paintings. My companions, eyes haunted by dread, hesitated. They looked to me, but I gestured urgently for them to go, not wanting to risk another collapse. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, but I refused to let them see my terror. One by one, they disappeared down the corridor, their lights bobbing along the tunnel's slick walls. I remained behind, feeling the cave's cold presence envelop me. The faint echo of their footsteps vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Everything felt sharper. The stench of damp stone, the electric tension in the air, the unrelenting throbbing of my own pulse. I knelt at the painting station, my breath shallow and trembling. The brush felt crude in my grip, the pigments clammy. I took a moment to steady my hands, even as perspiration beaded on my brow. I glanced around, noticing how the phosphorescent glow from the fungus pulsed gently, like a living specter. My arms shook, and tears stung the edges of my eyes, though I couldn't let them fall. In the distance, I heard a subtle scraping, like the echo of something shifting in the cave's depths. I didn't know if it was another tremor, or the presence of that horrifying reflection of ourselves, or perhaps the cave itself breathing. Each exhalation felt more difficult than the last, as though the air was thickening around me. My mind spun with visions of the figures we had encountered, those identical forms that seemed locked in a time loop. A nauseating dread spiked through my gut as I recalled the final instruction of the paintings, to keep the cycle alive, to ensure that the next group would have its story recorded. Closing my eyes, I tried to block out the terror. When I opened them again, I saw, with heart-stopping clarity, a blank section of wall. My mind, or something deeper, guided my hand to begin etching new shapes. I felt compelled to depict everything I had just experienced. My group's desperate arrival, the storm, the haunting paintings, the horrifying discovery of our own reflections in that time-forgotten chamber. Each stroke on the rock felt like a piece of my own reality being surrendered. The dryness in my mouth intensified, and my chest felt tight as though I were suffocating. And then I paused, sensing the flicker of something behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see only darkness, but the phosphorescent glow revealed a faint silhouette standing at the edge of the alcove. My heart thundered, and cold perspiration clung to my skin. I strained to make out the shape. Was it me, or some reflection of me standing there? I forced myself to breathe, to calm the shaking in my limbs. After what felt like an eternity, the figure receded into the corridor. In its absence, I was alone with nothing but the damp rock, the brush in my hand, and the silent hum of the cave's timeless nature, my own reflection in this endless cycle. I turned back to the wall, painting what must come next, the path to the exit, the group stepping into the storm-lashed mountainside, and one figure, me, remaining behind. I wanted to add something hopeful, some sign that I would find a way to break the cycle. But the cave refused my wish. The images flowed from me like a ritual, capturing a story that had repeated countless times before. As I finished, a dizzy spell overtook me, forcing me to lean against the cool stone. The air tasted stale and metallic. I inhaled sharply, feeling my lungs burn. My heart pounded with the finality of what I had done. I stared at the painting, at my own shape kneeling in that symbolic pose, part of an unbroken chain of attempts that never quite achieved true freedom. And yet, I held on to a sliver of resolve, refusing to accept complete despair. If there was a way out, even from within this role, I intended to find it. The walls around me seemed to vibrate once more. Or maybe it was my pulse throbbing in my ears. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness wash over me, uncertain whether it was the beginning of an inescapable nightmare or the first step toward a terrifying liberation. In the hush of that cave, I waited, heart hammering, sweat freezing on my brow. mind teetering on the brink of belief and madness. Outside, the storm might have continued raging or subsided completely, but inside, time had no meaning. My companions were gone, presumably free, while I remained to complete the story for whoever would arrive next. And so I linger here, uncertain whether this arrangement is final, or if I might someday trace my way back through the winding tunnels to the world I once knew. The fear gnaws at me, a constant companion. Yet a tiny ember of willpower keeps me from collapsing into absolute despair. As the last flicker of my flashlight dims, and the phosphorescent glow becomes my only guide, I wrestle with the truth. I am both prisoner and witness, bound to this cyclical fate. The silence is absolute, and it bears the weight of countless repetitions. Every heartbeat reminds me of the cold truth scrawled on the walls. The cycle demands a keeper. I have taken that role for now. One day, perhaps, I will find a fissure in this timeless labyrinth and break away. Until then, each breath I manage to take is a defiance of the dread that weighs on my chest. The paintings are my testament, and the cave is my vigil. Even with no certainty of escape, I cling to the possibility that my story might one day serve as a path to freedom. For me, or for the next group that dares to seek shelter here. Story 11. I remember the first time I switched on that old television. The screen hissed with static, then flashed a single image, my own reflection in the dark, wide-eyed with unease. Even before the ghostly shapes materialized, there was a disquieting pull in the air, as though the atmosphere in my workshop had thickened. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and I felt an inexplicable chill crawl along my spine. It was as if the universe itself had inhaled, holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. I'm an electronics technician by trade, the kind of person who hoards old circuit boards and rummages for vacuum tubes no one cares about anymore. It was no surprise then that a dusty wood-paneled television set ended up in my possession. It had belonged to my grandfather, left for me in a sealed trunk, labeled with a single faded word, Rosetta. I assumed it was just another relic. Part of me was excited because vintage TVs are usually simple to repair, and I could add it to my growing collection. But from the very moment I unpacked that archaic device, something felt fundamentally wrong. The cabinet was made of aged oak, polished to a shine, but strangely warm to the touch. When I slid the back cover off, I found a labyrinth of wires unfamiliar even to me. They were twisted and spliced in ways that didn't match any standard schematic. A silent sense of foreboding settled in the pit of my stomach, a sour taste in my mouth that refused to go away. My hands trembled slightly as I inspected the vacuum tubes, noticing faint symbols etched on their glass surfaces. They weren't manufacturer marks. Rather, they seemed more like cryptic runes. That first night, the fear crept in subtly. I had connected the set to a power source, but left it unplugged from any antenna. Around 1 a.m, I woke to the low hum of electricity. My bedroom was at the other end of the hall, yet I could sense the faint glow emanating from my workshop. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs. With each step, sweat gathered at my temples and along my spine. When I reached the workshop door, I found the old television alive with static. I stood transfixed. The screen's glow flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows across disassembled stereos and half-finished circuit boards. There was no overt sign of invasion, no footsteps, no forced entry, just the unearthly glow of that device. My breathing grew rapid, my mouth dry as sand, but I forced myself to approach. Then came the first real moment of horror. In the swirling static, I saw my own workshop, though it appeared from an angle slightly above my own vantage point. It was like looking through a surveillance camera pointed at me. I saw my back, hunched in the dim light, moving closer to the TV. My throat constricted and a cold flush broke out over my skin. I yanked the plug from the wall. The screen went dark. Initially, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a stray signal, some glitch in the wiring. But deep down, I sensed there was more to this. Over the following days, I experimented with the set. I opened it again, carefully testing each component. The schematic was beyond me. full of intricacies that didn't match any electronics manual I'd studied. Eventually, I gave up trying to map it logically and powered it on. The TV displayed, with eerie clarity, my workshop's calendar for the next day and the day after, flipping through future dates like a slideshow. I saw a meeting with a client that wasn't even on my schedule yet. I saw a large order of electronic parts arrive at my doorstep before I had any intention of placing it. At first, I tried to fight it. For instance, when I saw myself shaking hands with a new client, a tall, broad-shouldered individual with an intense stare, I decided to skip the usual meet and greet. I called in sick that day, locked my doors, and refused all appointments. But by the end of the afternoon, the phone rang repeatedly. A friend mentioned that a man had shown up at the repair shop I sometimes freelance at, specifically asking for me. Suddenly, that image on the TV felt too close for comfort. Despite everything I did, the event played out exactly as shown. The handshake occurred precisely as the device had displayed, only in a different location than I'd expected. My muscles tightened with dread. I felt trapped, as if a noose had been slipped around my neck. Each prediction that appeared on the screen manifested with almost malevolent glee in real life, no matter how I tried to avoid it. Eventually, I felt a paranoid weight pressing on my chest. Every time the set flickered to life on its own, I would break into a cold sweat, my pulse hammering in my ears. Sometimes it showed mundane tasks, me cooking a quick meal or sorting through wires at my workbench. Other times, the scenes were more ominous. My reflection in the mirror, only it would shift and distort as if a hidden presence stood behind me. My hands would tremble so violently that I had to set aside any delicate electronics work for hours after. Then the visions grew impossible to ignore. Late one night, the TV showed me wandering through my hallway, following a strange, static-laden figure that seemed to beckon from behind a door that didn't exist in my actual home. The device crackled, and the hallway on-screen elongated, angles warping to improbable degrees. My reflection in the scuffed floor seemed to move independently, twisting its head at an unnatural angle. It felt less like a prediction and more like some surreal invitation or a trap. I tried to shut it off. The power button did nothing. Even when I unplugged the cord, the screen continued to flicker, fueling my sense of creeping despair. My throat tightened, I could barely swallow, and my vision blurred with panic. I was too frightened to sleep. I left the workshop and sat in my living room, every light blazing, as if brightness alone could ward off the shadows. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me. I dozed off, only to wake up later to darkness. The overhead lamps had all shorted out simultaneously. My heart thudded with fear as I crept back to the workshop to find the TV glowing. It was playing scenes of me fidgeting on the living room couch, exactly as I had been. The feed had a slight delay, as if something was watching me from a vantage point not bound by normal space. My entire body shook with an electrifying dread I'd never experienced before. Convinced something was deeply wrong, I dug into my grandfather's old notebooks. I discovered fragmented notes that spoke of a gateway device, references to possibilities fed upon by the hungry mirror, and diagrams that made no logical sense. Words like dimensional pivot and parasitic frequencies were scrawled over schematic sketches. Each page reeked of obsession. My palms grew slick with sweat as I read phrases suggesting the television was not just a receiver, but a creator of events. According to the notes, it tapped into an alternate dimension that thrived on unrealized outcomes. My grandfather had apparently built it to glimpse futures and channel raw potential, but the notes hinted at a horrifying catch. The dimension was hungry, always seeking new realities to devour, and the device served as a direct gateway. The more I read, the more the boundaries of my world started to warp. Strange echoes haunted my house at night, distant knocks and scraping sounds that would vanish the moment I held my breath to listen more closely. My reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes lagged behind me, or appeared out of sync. Standing in the shower, I'd catch glimpses of the tiles shifting in shape just beyond my peripheral vision. My skin would crawl, prickling with goosebumps that never fully subsided. I tried rational measures, like consulting a friend who worked in advanced physics. I relayed the gist of my experiences in a shaky voice, avoiding direct mention of dimensional portals. He responded with a half-laugh, half-sympathetic tone, suggesting it might be stress or an overactive imagination. When I pressed further, describing the surreal angles and the device's hold over future events, he grew uneasy and told me that no known physics could explain it. He advised me to seek professional help, though he didn't say it outright. Still, his concern was clear. My heart sank as I realized I wouldn't get an answer or even relief from that angle. Returning home, the corridor lights seemed weaker than before, as if the air itself had dimmed. The floor creaked in a rhythmic pulse, making my hair stand on end. In my workshop, I found the TV humming at a frequency that vibrated in my teeth. On its screen was a close-up of my own eye, bloodshot and terrified, blinking in slow motion. Each blink felt like a countdown. By this point, I could hardly breathe, suffocated by an invisible pressure. My palms were clammy, and I was shivering despite the warmth in the room. The next day, the set showed me walking through my neighborhood, yet the background was contorted, a bizarre reflection of the streets I knew. Buildings were slanted at acute angles, cars parked upside down, and the sky was a disconcerting shade of maroon. I tried to forget it and leave my house as normal, but soon enough, I noticed small discrepancies outside. A bent street lamp, a faint red hue to the clouds. It was like reality itself was starting to align with the twisted visions on that screen. My heart hammered so fiercely I felt dizzy. The laws of my world were being rewritten, one minor shift at a time. I became consumed by the idea that the television wasn't just forecasting the future, but rewriting it. Each time it powered on, it imposed another layer of that parasitic dimension over my own. My nights were sleepless, haunted by the static hiss that seemed to seep through walls. I'd wake up drenched in cold sweat, muscles cramped and eyes burning, only to stumble into the workshop and find the TV show me wandering the house like a phantom, eyes glazed with desperation. Determined to break the cycle, I tried to destroy the set. My first attempt was physical. I swung a hammer at the screen, adrenaline surging, heart pounding with savage intensity. Yet the instant I struck the glass, the hammer reverberated as if striking thick steel. A shock traveled up my arm, sending a painful jolt through my shoulders. I nearly dropped the hammer. The screen remained intact, not even a scratch. My second attempt involved dismantling it from the inside, cutting wires, removing tubes. But every time I opened the back, the components were different, shifting. I'd pull out a vacuum tube, only to look back and see it had reappeared. Frustration and terror coiled in my gut. My hands shook so badly that I nearly stabbed myself with a screwdriver. As the days bled into nights, my home became a warped maze. Doors appeared in places they shouldn't exist, while familiar rooms seemed to shrink or expand unpredictably. At times, I felt an invisible presence following me. I'd rush around corners, heart in my throat, only to see emptiness. My reflection continued to distort. Sometimes it wore an expression that wasn't mine, or it mouthed words I couldn't decipher. The perimeter of my vision was always alive with subtle motion, shadows that darted out of sight the moment I turned my head. Then came the final revelation on the TV. Late one night, it showed me standing outside in a bizarre version of my neighborhood. The static parted like curtains, revealing buildings suspended upside down in the sky, and the roads had become sinuous paths of red brick. My figure on screen gazed up at swirling black shapes that loomed overhead, flickering with malignant energy. The hissing audio rose in pitch, pressing against my eardrums until I almost cried out in pain. I watched, transfixed, as I saw myself step through a rent in the air, like a tear in reality, vanishing into that alien realm. Fighting waves of terror, I realized the device was forcing this outcome. It wanted me to cross into that dimension fully, letting it devour every unrealized possibility of my existence. My grandfather's notes had spoken of a parasitic realm that thrived on potential events, gradually displacing entire realities. By building the set, he had opened a door he couldn't close. Desperate, I resolved to face the television's power head-on. I forced myself to watch the final scene until my heart pounded so violently that my chest felt ready to burst. A dizzying wash of panic made my vision blur, yet I refused to look away. My breath came in shallow gasps, my stomach twisting with nausea. The screen flickered, and I perceived a chance, a single moment where the swirling shapes glitched. Summoning every last scrap of courage, I unplugged the cord. This time something cracked in the air. A wave of disorienting force swept over me, as if two conflicting realities collided in that instant. The workshop lights popped with sparks, plunging the room into darkness. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face. When I opened my eyes, a faint gray dawn lit the workshop. I staggered to my feet, half expecting to see monstrous shapes lurking in every corner. But everything was still, almost normal. My hands shook as I scanned the area for the TV. It stood silent in the center of the room, looking like just another antique set. No glow, no hum. With trembling fingers, I pressed the power button. Nothing happened. I checked every angle, but it was dark, inert. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the atmosphere in the room still trembled with residual energy, like a spider's web humming after being plucked. In the days that followed, I searched for signs that the warped dimension might still be bleeding through. Occasionally, I would notice a random door handle in my house shift an inch higher, or a reflection in the window seem slightly delayed. Sometimes I would hear the television click on at night, only to rush in and find it still dark. Whenever that happened, my heart pounded and a cold sweat erupted on my forehead. I still feel as though something hovers right beyond my peripheral vision, waiting. I haven't thrown the TV away because part of me worries that destroying it might undo the fragile boundary I forced into place. I'm certain that realm is still out there, ravenous for new possibilities. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear a faint static whisper calling from inside the old set. And in those moments, my pulse drums against my eardrums, my throat tightens, and a wave of claustrophobia washes over me. Every day I check my surroundings, questioning whether I've truly escaped or if I'm merely living a future the device has created, waiting for the next monstrous shift in reality. The sense of being watched, of existing in a precarious overlap between worlds, lingers like a heavy fog. I continue my electronics work, but my confidence is fractured. The simplest tasks feel weighted with dread. I jump at the slightest flicker of a light bulb. My breath catches whenever my phone screen glitches or my computer monitor flickers unexpectedly. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about my grandfather's intentions and whether he understood the risk he was taking when he built that parasitic gateway. But then I stop. Some questions are better left unanswered. I've managed for now to seal that demonic invention in darkness. Yet the tension in my chest never fully eases. There's a piece of me that knows it's only a matter of time before that hungry realm finds another opportunity to push its way through. And when it does, I'll either have to face it again, or lose everything I know to the nightmares it brings. Even now, as I write this, a faint hum resonates through the workshop walls. My hands tremble, and my breath comes in shallow bursts. Is it just the wiring in the walls, or the muffled approach of that other place, clamoring for another chance? I can't be sure. All I know is that my reality has been changed forever. I haven't died, haven't vanished, but I'm also not the same person who once confidently repaired electronics in a tidy workspace free of nightmares. The old television sits there, silent for the moment, but holding a truth that leaves my soul perpetually uneasy. With every drawn breath, I sense the tenuous nature of my existence, haunted by what might still unfold, and by what the darkness behind that screen might yet demand. Pour que tu vois. Story 12. There are some nights that weigh heavier than others, especially when your mind starts to unravel beneath flickering fluorescent lights in a near-deserted office. I remember the moment I first felt that weight, a subtle prickle at the back of my neck, a whispered warning from instincts honed by countless hours of coding in the dead of night. The floor was quiet, but not peaceful. The air stale, yet tinged with a tension I couldn't quite name. Something felt wrong, unsettlingly wrong, and I found myself on edge before I even knew why. No one had died or vanished. No one had even raised their voice. Yet the very silence reeked of secrets kept and illusions carefully maintained. I was a senior software developer at a thriving tech company known for innovative solutions and a cutthroat atmosphere. My daily routine involved brainstorming sessions, code reviews, and the occasional bug hunt. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to the stress, the politicking, and the late-night sprints to meet deadlines. What I was not prepared for was the presence of someone like him. They introduced my new colleague one Monday morning. I had heard rumors about a brilliant developer coming to revolutionize our project. Despite the usual corporate fanfare, I remember feeling a dull ache in my temples as soon as he walked in. Maybe it was how casually he breezed through the introductions, with a radiant smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, head slightly tilted as though he could see through my professional facade. He was charismatic, sure, tall, confident, impeccably dressed. But there was a chill in the room whenever he spoke. Colleagues seemed drawn to him in a trance-like fascination, nodding along even when he said little of substance. It was as if his mere presence commanded obedience. I tried to brush off my discomfort, chalking it up to jealousy. After all, I'd built my reputation the hard way, through results and endless lines of code. He just swept in, commanding attention with that unstoppable charm. Yet the more I worked with him, the deeper my unease grew. Little things started happening. Strange compiler errors that vanished whenever I tried to show them to someone else. Unexplainable bugs reappearing after I'd fixed them, and entire sections of code overwritten by older versions. At first, I considered that maybe I was just burning out. Sleep deprivation can cause mistakes, so I forced myself to double-check everything, keep backups, and meticulously document each commit. However, each time I felt certain I had done things correctly, these issues cropped up again. It was infuriating. I'd go to my boss, but by the time he looked at my workstation, the code was as pristine as I'd intended it to be. My new colleague would be by the water cooler, leaning against the wall with a confident smirk, winking at me in a way that made my skin crawl. It was as if he knew he'd driven me to question my own competence. Eventually, I started suspecting sabotage. Paranoia crept into my life, and I found myself checking door logs, sign-in sheets, anything that would prove someone else accessed my computer. Each time, I came up with nothing. My nights grew restless. I'd lie awake, heart racing, certain I'd forgotten something critical or left some vulnerability open in the code. The next day, I'd arrive early, jittery from too much caffeine, only to find everything undone again. Yet there was never hard evidence, only fleeting glimpses of my new colleague hovering near my desk, or a cryptic comment from a coworker about how I should take it easy. I began collecting my own logs using hidden tools. I started logging my code changes and encrypting them in personal archives. At first, it yielded no results. Then, late one Friday evening, when almost everyone had gone home, I noticed an access attempt on my station while I was in the break room. Rushing back, I found no one there. But the logs showed my new colleague's network credentials used to open my project files. Finally, I had confirmation I wasn't losing my mind. However, when I presented this finding, managers seemed oddly dismissive. They said network credentials could be spoofed, or maybe I had read the log incorrectly. My heart pounded with frustration, and my mouth went dry as I realized how carefully he'd covered his tracks. No matter what I said, no one believed me. They told me to relax, maybe consider a short break. That was when I started digging deeper into the company archives. I thought if he had done this to me, perhaps he'd done it to others. Late nights in the quiet records room, with dust motes dancing under the buzzing ceiling light, I pored over past employees' files. A pattern emerged. Similar complaints from different individuals who left abruptly or were terminated for performance issues. Their accounts hinted at bizarre technical glitches no one else could replicate. But each record was vague, the details redacted or missing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I realized how consistently these incidents matched my experience. Then came the first big jolt of realization. In an old file from decades ago, I found a grainy photograph from a team outing. The date indicated the company's early years, maybe 70 years prior. And there, in the back row, was someone who looked eerily like my new colleague. Same posture, same confident tilt of the head, same cold eyes. His face hadn't aged a day. My vision blurred for a moment, and I felt a sharp sting of sweat in my eyes. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a relative or a weird coincidence. Yet my stomach churned with an indescribable dread. That evening I couldn't concentrate on anything else. The office's fluorescent lights flickered incessantly, casting unsettling shadows against the walls. Every sound, from the hum of air vents to the rumble of distant servers, seemed amplified. A sense of being watched overwhelmed me. I told no one but pressed further, scanning additional archival photographs. And there he was again, in corporate retreats from the 1960s, 1980s, early 2000s, always looking the same. If I thought I was paranoid before, this discovery shattered any remaining composure. My heart pounded, my breath hitched, and I found myself checking over my shoulder every few seconds. My reflection in the window looked haunted, eyes wide with a fear I could no longer mask. I remember the heat rising in my cheeks as I typed feverishly on my keyboard, running a facial recognition software. I fed it images from multiple decades, from multiple companies' historical newsletters and promotional materials. The results were horrifyingly consistent. It was the same person. The logs showed matches from photos dating back to the beginning of the 20th century. My vision swam, and I fought the urge to gag. This was no ordinary coworker. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. Nobody lives that long looking exactly the same. Yet the horrifying evidence blinked in front of me, an unyielding red confirmation of my worst suspicions. It all came crashing down one night when I stayed particularly late to finalize a series of bug fixes. Around midnight, an unexplainable chill filled the office. My entire body tensed, cold sweat trickling down my spine. I sensed someone behind me. Turning, I met his gaze. He stood there in the dim glow of the emergency lights, smiling in a way that froze my blood. In a calm yet chilling tone, he addressed my findings. It wasn't a long speech, but the gist was that he knew I'd uncovered his secret. I remember his words not as direct quotes, but as a haunting echo describing how he had existed for a long, long time, sustaining himself on the wasted potential of others. My stomach clenched, and my pulse throbbed in my temples. I felt like a trapped animal. He made it clear that each time he singled out someone with promise, he would sabotage their work, push them to the brink of self-destruction, and feast on the frustration of their unfulfilled ambitions. That, he explained, was how he maintained his youth, by siphoning off the energy from those crushed dreams. I could barely breathe. My mouth went dry. The walls around me felt as though they were closing in. He started to move closer, describing, in that disturbingly calm manner, how he had ruined careers for decades, how even the slightest doubt could cripple a brilliant mind. I backed away, my heart hammering so loudly I thought I might pass out. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and for an instant, his face seemed to distort under the harsh shadows, like two faces overlapping, one youthful, one ancient and weathered, as though he was both the man I knew and some timeless being. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and a wave of nausea swelled in my gut. I mumbled something about no one believing him, no one letting him get away with it. He just laughed, an echoing, hollow sound that sank into my bones. I recall him saying, more or less, that I could try to warn people, but they wouldn't take me seriously. They never had before. He mentioned how easy it was to appear flawless, how simple it was to manipulate systems, or turn colleagues against the very person trying to expose the truth. My hands shook uncontrollably as I realized I was alone in that dim corridor with a being that defied every law of nature I knew. The shadows cast by the pale emergency light made the space feel claustrophobic. My breathing was ragged, my throat constricted, and my shirt clung to my skin, soaked with cold sweat. I'm not sure what compelled me to speak again. but my voice emerged, cracking under the weight of terror. I told him I had backups of my findings, and if anything happened to me, others would discover the truth eventually. He seemed amused by the idea, but also slightly irritated. I saw a flicker of annoyance cross his features before he resumed that unsettling composure. In that moment, I realized I had to leave the building. I had to escape, or I'd forever be ensnared by whatever fate he intended for me. He made no move to stop me right then. Perhaps he wanted me to sink deeper into fear and paranoia, to feed off my despair. Or maybe it amused him to watch me scramble, knowing he could still orchestrate my downfall from the shadows. Whatever the reason, I took advantage of his hesitation. I bolted down the hallway, nearly tripping over tangled cables by the server room. My heart thundered as I raced past darkened offices, the echo of my own frantic footsteps pursuing me. As I reached the elevator, I realized the power to certain areas had been shut down. The elevator wasn't responding. A wave of claustrophobic panic washed over me. My pulse reverberated in my skull. The stairwell was my only option. It was dark, the emergency lighting barely functioning, casting flickering shadows that seemed to shift and contort in my peripheral vision. Every step I took reverberated through the concrete walls, and I kept glancing back, convinced that any second he might appear behind me. Somehow I made it to the ground floor, chest burning, legs trembling from the adrenaline. I burst through the exit and stumbled into the cool night air. An inexplicable sense of relief washed over me for a split second, though it was immediately eclipsed by the realization that I had nowhere safe to go. My car was in the parking lot, but would he let me drive away? If he'd been manipulating everything from network logs to corporate relationships, was my entire life under his control? The panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys. My hands were trembling so violently that it took 2 attempts to get the door open. Slamming it behind me, I locked myself in. The silence inside the vehicle felt oppressive, and for a moment, I expected to see his face reflected in the rearview mirror. Thankfully, it was only my own pale, sweat-drenched face staring back, eyes wide with a terror I'd never experienced before. I started the engine and drove off, heart still pounding, convinced I was being followed. Every time a pair of headlights appeared in my rear view, I broke into a cold sweat, half certain it was him. My vision blurred from tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. When I finally reached my apartment, I ran inside, double-locked the door, and stood in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and my entire body shook as if trying to rid itself of the lingering presence of that entity. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, unchanging through the decades, devouring the potential of countless bright minds. I tossed and turned, drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around my legs like constricting vines. If I drifted off, I dreamed of endless corridors lined with monitors showing the same mocking smile. In those nightmares, I heard the hum of flickering lights overhead, reverberating like a dreadful chant. Morning arrived with a thin, gray light that did nothing to banish my fears, but in that bleak dawn I felt a spark of resolve. I wasn't sure how I'd fight something so ancient and malevolent, yet I knew I had to try. I still possessed the records, the photos, the facial recognition results hidden behind layers of encryption. Even if no one believed me, I had proof. As I stared at my exhausted reflection in the bathroom mirror, eyes bloodshot, skin clammy, I admitted the truth. This was bigger than me. I might never destroy him, but perhaps I could shine enough light on his existence to deny him another easy target. I took a leave of absence from work, telling colleagues I needed space to deal with burnout. In the weeks that followed, I anonymously sent small bits of evidence to those I trusted, hinting at corruption and sabotage within the company. I didn't reveal the supernatural aspect. No one would have believed it. But I planted seeds of doubt, ensuring people knew that something wasn't right. It felt like a dangerously thin plan, yet it was all I could do while I wrestled with my own sanity. Each night I expected him to materialize in my apartment, continuing his predatory game. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip a beat. Every shadow seemed to hold his figure. The paranoia was suffocating, but I managed to stay vigilant. Then, surprisingly, he made no direct move. Perhaps he had switched tactics, or maybe there were other promising individuals elsewhere. I tried to convince myself that he'd let me slip away, but I could never truly believe it. He was patient, after all, and had all the time in the world. Now, as I type these final words, I can still feel that cold knot of dread buried deep in my stomach. The memory of his voice, calmly describing how he drew life from wasted potential, makes my hands tremble on the keyboard. Despite my best efforts, I haven't exposed him to the world. I've only managed to peel back a corner of the shroud he's wrapped around countless careers, countless aspirations. Maybe that's enough to put him on guard, or maybe it just amuses him. I can't say what will happen next, but I know one thing with absolute certainty. I will never return to that office. The mere thought of walking those corridors under those flickering fluorescent lights again sets my pulse racing and drenches me in sweat. Even now, in the relative safety of my home, I sense that oppressive presence, an echo of a centuries-old hunger that defies all logic. I keep my eyes open, and I listen for the faintest signal that he's near. The question that haunts me every sleepless night is whether it's truly over, or if my potential has already become the next feast for that eternal, malevolent force. Story 13. The night I set sail on that pristine new vessel, I felt an unsettling pull in my gut, as though the ocean itself had woken up just to watch my every move. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual at first. The sky above was a canopy of distant stars, and the moon cast dancing glimmers across the waves. But there was something in the air, something stifling and cold, despite the balmy breeze. Even the gulls' cries in the distance seemed distorted. I recall gripping the helm and feeling a prickling sensation run down my neck, as if unseen eyes were locked on me from every direction. That's how it began, an almost imperceptible weight in the atmosphere, pressing against my ribs and making me breathe just a little bit shallower. I remember marveling at my new sailboat. I had invested months of planning and research, meticulously studying hull shapes, sail patterns, and the placement of every last bolt. I wanted to create a boat that would handle smoothly and glide across the water with minimal effort, an engineering dream. The design was unique, unlike anything else on the harbor. I'd spent many late nights in my workshop, guided by diagrams and references I'd discovered in old maritime journals. Some of those diagrams had seemed eccentric, featuring bizarre symbols around the edges. I'd brushed them off as archaic scribbles or decorative flourishes. They fit so perfectly with my design goals that I never questioned their true origins. My first real test run took place far out at sea, at least a day's journey from the nearest shoreline. I had everything I needed: food supplies, fresh water, a toolbox, navigational equipment, and even a small backup motor if the wind died down. My plan was to spend 2 nights at sea. On the first night, everything went smoothly. I felt free. The wind was calm but steady, and the boat responded to my lightest touch. The next morning, though, the rudder started to feel off. A shudder passed through the deck as I adjusted course, and the boat jerked, resisting any attempt to steer. I climbed down below to inspect the linkage, fiddling with bolts and cables while the sun beat mercilessly overhead. My heart pounded with the fear that I'd made a critical error in the design. At one point, I thought I heard my name whispered inside the cabin. Just a soft hush, like a voice carried on a stray current of air. I froze, nearly dropping my wrench. There was no one else on the boat, yet I felt the distinct presence of something right behind me. I whirled around. Nothing was there. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Yet the longer I stayed down there, the heavier the air felt, pressing on me until I had to gasp to catch my breath. My palms were slick with sweat, and my shirt clung to my torso. Once I realized the rudder was jammed beyond a quick fix, I took a breather on deck. The sun hung at an angle that told me it was late afternoon. I stared at the horizon, hoping to see a faint shape of land. But there was nothing, only endless water. The ocean's surface had taken on a strangely dark hue, and the wind seemed to whisper in disjointed rhythms. My chest felt tight, my heart thrumming in double time. Part of me wanted to activate the backup motor right then and return to port. But another part, the stubborn side, refused to give up. I needed to prove my craft was seaworthy. I still believed it was some minor mechanical hitch. As dusk approached, the wind shifted direction, and the sails luffed. Something about the shift of air pressure brought me a chill, even though it was not particularly cold. My breath came faster, and I noticed goosebumps on my forearms. When the first stars emerged, they looked different, somehow more distant but also more watchful. I can't explain it except to say that I felt observed, like those stars were conscious eyes bearing silent witness to my predicament. The compass on my console began spinning lazily, as though it had lost any sense of north. I tried tapping it, shaking it, and rechecking my manual compass. Both showed erratic swings, refusing to settle on a heading. At that moment, I heard the ocean calling my name again. This time the whisper was less timid, as though it wanted me to know it was real. My breath caught in my throat. A tremor ran through my legs, and my stomach twisted into knots. I scanned the pitch-black water, searching for any sign of another vessel or a drifting buoy with a radio. There was only blackness and the faint reflection of stars. The whisper came again, my name drawn out like a lament, floating across the waves before fading into the night air. Panic set in, and my tongue felt parched. I rummaged through my supplies, gulping water from a bottle until I could feel my pulse slow just a bit. The idea of being stranded with a broken rudder was terrifying enough, but the sense that something beyond human comprehension was pulling me toward deeper waters was far worse. My arms felt heavy, and each inhalation seemed to catch on a hook in my lungs. The rigging creaked overhead, and the hull groaned as if the boat itself was alive. With my limited mechanical knowledge, I attempted a more thorough repair. I used a flashlight to inspect the rudder assembly from inside the cockpit. To my horror, certain bolts were warped, twisted in a way that didn't make sense. They looked almost melted, the metal contorted into bizarre shapes. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Electrolytic corrosion? Some freak chemical reaction with salt water? But it had only been one day out at sea. My hands trembled as I tried to find a solution, and my heart thudded so hard that my vision blurred at the edges. Meanwhile, the boat drifted, or at least I thought it drifted. But after a few minutes, I realized it was moving. Not with the current, not with the wind. It was moving against the natural flow, like it had a mind of its own. The sea felt deeper all around me, the ocean floor dropping into a vast chasm beneath the hull. I turned on the sonar to check the depth, and the reading made no sense. It displayed a sudden plunge in the seabed, and then began detecting some mammoth structure rising from below. Impossible, I kept telling myself. Yet the readings persisted. It was as though something was ascending, an expansive formation pushing up from the murky depths. I began to remember odd details from the old maritime journals I'd used as references for my sailboat's design. There were cryptic statements about sacred geometry used by ancient seafaring cults, rumored to open doorways to submerged realms. I had laughed at those passages at the time, but now I couldn't ignore the possibility. My design, with all its meticulous lines and angles, might not have been so original after all. A sense of dread gnawed at my insides as I recalled those bizarre symbols around the diagrams. My skin tingled with raw anxiety. Tension built steadily, suffocating me. The starlight above distorted, forming patterns in the sky that I'd never seen before. Constellations merged and reformed, twisting into shapes that felt alien to my eyes. I could barely remain upright. My knees were weak and sweat poured down my neck. Every nerve in my body shrieked in alarm. My mouth was so dry that I couldn't swallow, yet I was compelled to watch, powerless against this cosmic puppeteer yanking on unseen strings. Occasionally, I would mutter a few words to myself, half-formed thoughts trying to stay grounded in reality. Once I caught myself speaking as if to the sea. "Please, let me go back." My voice trembled, the words almost swallowed by the wind. Then I realized I was shaking uncontrollably, my teeth rattling together. I forced myself to close my eyes and breathe, but that only intensified the sense that I was being lured somewhere I never should have ventured. Hours passed in a blur. My watch had stopped. The moon hung above, huge and swollen, casting sharp angles of light that made every corner of my boat look twisted and foreign. The air carried a low hum, more a vibration than a sound. And still, that voice whispered my name, drawing out the syllables with an eerie affection. My heart pounded against my ribcage. My hands grew stiff from gripping the edge of the cockpit. My entire body ached with the tension of bracing for something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the sonar let out a series of beeps, becoming more insistent as I drifted over the rising structure beneath me. Checking the screen, I saw a complex mass of shapes, spires or towers maybe. It was vast, far larger than any sunken ship. The murky outline resembled a city, an ancient network of carved stone or coral, intricate and labyrinthine. My mind reeled at the thought of a submerged metropolis. I recalled stories of lost civilizations rumored to have vanished beneath the waves eons ago. Fear clutched at my chest, threatening to clamp my lungs shut. I scrambled to the deck, shining my flashlight on the dark water. For a moment, the beam illuminated something that looked like an archway just below the surface, maybe 30 feet away. Then it was gone, concealed once more by the rolling waves. Every hair on my body stood on end. My breathing accelerated into ragged gulps of air. A part of me wanted to jump overboard and swim away, though I knew that was madness. Another part wanted to stow myself deep in the cabin and wait for dawn, but the boat kept inching forward, drawn by a force that defied explanation. In a desperate attempt to fight back, I tried to drop anchor. I hurled the anchor over the side, hoping it would catch onto something and halt my progress. To my dismay, the rope continued to spool out. The depth seemed bottomless. My anchor line eventually reached its end, and still there was no tension. It was as if the ocean had become an abyss without a floor. I leaned over the rail and my stomach lurched as vertigo hit me. The sense of immeasurable depth tugged at my mind, making me lightheaded and queasy. At this point, my paranoia was all-consuming. I questioned every sound, every ripple in the water. The slightest gust of wind sent prickles through my spine. I was convinced that living shapes moved just beneath the waves, circling the hull, whispering my name in conspiratorial tones. Every bit of logic I possessed told me this couldn't be real. But my senses insisted otherwise. My breath came in frantic bursts, and my pulse hammered in my ears. As I circled the deck, scanning the horizon for any ship or rescue plane, I noticed the sails themselves. The design, those angular lines I had painstakingly sewn, glowed faintly under the moonlight. They formed a geometry that seemed more alive than cloth and rope should be. The patterns reminded me of the strange symbols I'd once dismissed as decorative. A realization sank in. I had recreated a key of sorts, an unholy blueprint that was opening a gateway for whatever slept down there in that sunken city. I fought back tears of desperation. My voice cracked as I muttered curses under my breath. The boat lurched again, as though acknowledging my fear. The dread in my chest intensified, an almost physical burden that made it hard to stand. The city below was stirring, or so I believed. I pictured enormous, time-worn structures shifting and awakening, their inhabitants eager to emerge from centuries of watery exile. My entire body trembled, and I clung to the side of the boat for balance. Then, in the midst of this oppressive terror, the sea began to glow. Not brightly, but with a faint phosphorescence that traced outlines of unimaginable forms beneath the surface. They resembled pillars, archways, and large monolithic statues that defied any architecture I knew. My breath hitched, and I tasted the salt of my own sweat on my lips. Every muscle tensed, ready to snap like a frayed wire. I tried to remain logical. I told myself to start the backup motor. If I could just force the boat to turn away, maybe I could break whatever thrall I was under. I stumbled to the stern, my legs wobbling as if I'd run a marathon. My heart pounded so violently I feared I might pass out. With trembling hands, I yanked the motor's starter cord. It sputtered, coughed, but refused to roar to life. I tried again and again until my arm burned. Nothing. It was as if the motor was choking on the very air around it. In that moment, the skies above seemed to twist, forming swirling patterns of stars that had no place in any celestial chart. My name echoed from every direction, a chorus of voices that rumbled through my bones. Terror seized my mind. I felt my sanity teetering on the edge. My mouth went dry, and my vision blurred with tears I couldn't hold back. My skin crawled with the sensation of being caressed by invisible hands, urging me to surrender. Just when I thought my mind would snap, I remembered the emergency flares. With trembling fingers, I fumbled for the flare gun stashed in a watertight compartment. I could barely grip it, my palms slick with sweat. My heart hammered so loudly it drowned out the crash of the waves. I aimed skyward and fired. The flare soared, creating a brief arc of red light. For a fraction of a second, I imagined I saw a swirling mass of black shapes overhead, retreating from that sudden glow. Or perhaps my fevered mind conjured illusions in the darkness. The flare descended, its light dimming, but I repeated the action, sending up a second fiery streak. Then I heard something. Static from the radio, or maybe a faint signal. In desperation, I tuned the frequency, adjusting the dial with shaky hands. I caught a faint response, an incomprehensible murmur that might have been a question. My throat felt constricted, but I managed to send out a distress call, explaining that my rudder was down, my position uncertain. Through the static, I interpreted an affirmative crackle. Someone had heard me. Relief warred with lingering dread in my chest. I felt my breathing slow, though my skin still crawled with the sensation of intangible watchers. I clung to the radio, repeating my plea until I received another garbled acknowledgement that rescue was en route. Part of me doubted help would find me in this otherworldly patch of ocean. Yet the simple act of communication lessened the suffocating isolation. Over the following hours, the compass resumed a gentle swing, its spinning gradually losing momentum. The glimmer beneath the water receded, sinking back into the silent abyss. I could almost sense a disappointed sigh reverberate through the hull, as though the ancient city recognized that its gateway would close once more. My boat rocked softly, no longer pulled against the current. I collapsed onto the deck, utterly spent, my muscles trembling in the aftermath of terror. My breath came ragged, my throat raw from panic. When dawn broke, the sky was a subdued gray, and a patrol boat's silhouette emerged on the horizon. I felt like I'd aged a decade. The rescue team eventually reached me, their faces etched with concern. I told them about the rudder failure, about hearing strange noises, and about how the compass had gone haywire. I didn't mention the voices calling my name or the vision of an ancient city beneath the waves. The rescue team members spoke calmly, asking for details, but I responded with half-truths, describing technical issues and nerves getting to me. They towed me back to shore, and I tried not to look at my sailboat as we traveled. Part of me feared that if I stared too long at those meticulously stitched sails, I would once again see the geometry shifting, beckoning me back to the deep. My mind felt fractured, and my hands still shook. The rescue team discussed mechanical failures, saltwater corrosion, and navigational errors, but I knew better. Something far older and more malevolent had touched me in that dark stretch of ocean. Back on land, I vowed never to speak of the whispers or the glimpses of that submerged metropolis. Yet even now, safe in my home, I can't shake the sensation of invisible eyes observing me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake drenched in sweat, convinced I hear my name drifting through an open window, carried on a distant tide. My heart will pound all over again, and I'll wonder if I truly escaped that sunken realm, or if some part of me remains bound to it, tethered by the unholy design I inadvertently resurrected. The thought keeps my chest tight and my breath uneven, forcing me to confront the disturbing truth. Once the ocean has called your name, it never really stops.